to Dead and Roasted. What can I get you?
Sometimes being American is so boring, what with my gold hockey medal and 1,200-calorie breakfasts. So I'm happy to say that I have a fun episode for you today that immerses us in a story straight from Scotland. A story about a man working to feed his family, but must endure the most hellish road in the world. This story, from One with the Contour, is titled The Drove Road. This is a tale from the break room. And you can find Tales from the Break Room on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. Follow us and leave us a rating if you like us. Thank you. My father was a livestock haulier in the Scottish Highlands for 31 years. He moved sheep and cattle between farms and markets across some of the most remote country in Britain, driving roads that don't appear on most maps, in weather that would keep sensible people indoors. In all that time, he only ever refused one route. If a contract required the B road between Kinlochmore and Cannock, he passed it to another driver and took the financial hit. And if you asked him why, he would change the subject so fast, you'd find yourself talking about football or the price of diesel before you realized what happened. He did this for 3 decades, and in those 3 decades, he explained himself exactly once. On the second to last night of his life, no less, in a hospital room in Inverness in the winter of 2004. 30 years of Richmond Super Kings had turned his lungs into something that could barely process air, and the man in that bed was so far from the man I grew up with that I had to remind myself more than once that they were the same person. He'd lost 4 stone. His skin had gone the color of dishwater. He breathed through a mask that fogged over with each exhale and cleared just enough between breaths to show his mouth moving underneath. And most of what he said in those final days was fragmented, drifting, half dissolved by morphine and exhaustion. But on that second to last night, when I was sitting beside his bed during a late visit because my mum had gone home to sleep and someone needed to be there, he turned his head on the pillow and looked at me with perfect clarity, saying, "Close the door." I closed it. He said to me, "Sit down." And so I sat. He then told me about the Drove Road, and he told it from beginning to end in a level and steady voice. But his eyes stayed fixated on the ceiling the entire time, like he was reading the story off the tiles. He talked for about an hour. When he was done, he closed his eyes for some time. I sat there, wordless, because there was nothing adequate to reply with. He died the following morning at 6:30. I was in the corridor getting coffee from the machine when it happened. That became one of those details that really shouldn't matter, but now I can't stop thinking about. Why was I grabbing coffee? Did it really matter? I've never repeated what he told me that night, but I am going to now. I'm 57 years old now, and this story deserves to be told. Also, as a note before I begin, I've changed all instances of kilometers to miles. I've spent most of my life in America at this point, and I know most people reading this will likely be American too. My father, Alistair, grew up in a village near Bewley, about 12 miles west of Inverness. He left school at 15. School wasn't producing results for anyone involved, and he got work on farms around the Glen, which in the Highlands in the late 1950s was less a career choice than a gravitational inevitability. He was good with animals, and good with engines too, but not particularly good with people, which is a combination that either makes you a mechanic or a haulier. When he got his HGV license at 20, he found that driving a loaded truck through empty landscape for hours at a stretch suited him quite well. He bought a second-hand Bedford TK from a dealer in Dingwall, and a livestock trailer from a farmer in Muir of Ord who was getting out of sheep, and by his mid-20s, he was making a decent living moving animals around the north of Scotland. Livestock haulage is unglamorous work, and I won't dwell on it long, but you need to understand a few things to follow what happened. A haulier's reputation depends on delivering animals in the same condition he collected them. Stressed sheep lose weight, panicked sheep trample each other. A bruise on a ewe's flank or a limp that wasn't there at loading is a mark against the driver, and enough marks mean farmers stop calling. My father was careful. He checked his trailer before every job. The floor, the walls, partition gates, bolts and hinges and welds. You see, a loose fitting or a sharp edge in a livestock trailer is a liability. And because he took a workman's pride in doing the job properly, he checked it thoroughly. I say this to you so you understand that when animals came off his trailer injured, he knew it wasn't the trailer. In the autumn of 1972, my father had said late October or early November, but he wasn't certain on the exact date. But he picked up a contract from a farmer named Drummond. Drummond ran a hill farm in a remote glen west of Cannock, which itself is a remote place, and he needed 60-odd blackface ewes moved to a lowland farm near Bewley for winter grazing. The distance was about 30 miles of road, but the route mattered more than the distance, because the most direct way between the 2 points involved a 12-mile stretch of single-track B road that crossed open moorland between the 2 glens. This road followed the line of what was locally called the Drove Road. Drove roads are old routes, some of them medieval, which were used for centuries to walk livestock to market. Scotland is full of them. Most have been paved over or absorbed into the modern road network, and you would never know you were driving on one unless someone told you. This one, though, was different, at least according to my father, because the locals still called it by a Gaelic name that he said translated to something like the Road of the Carried Dead. It had been a corpse road before it was a drove road, the path along which the dead were carried from the remote communities in the western glens to consecrated ground in the east. My father mentioned this as a background detail, but I could hear something underneath the words even through the morphine and the steady tone. Something that suggested he wished he'd paid more attention to it at the time. He had driven the road before without incident, though he noted, and I remember him pausing here briefly as if catching himself, that he had always driven it during daylight. The Drummond contract was different because of the logistics. Drummond's farm was at the end of a 5-mile track that was more suggestion than road, and the loading process with hill sheep is slow. Because the animals are half wild, they don't share the lowland sheep's resignation about being pushed into a trailer. By the time Alistair got the first batch loaded and cleared the farm track and reached the B road, the light would be gone. November in the Scottish Highlands means the sun sets at 4:30, and 4:30 comes faster than you expect when you're wrestling blackface ewes up a ramp. I should describe the road here. It's a single-track tarmac with passing places, no markings, no cat's eyes, no lighting. It crosses open moorland, flat peat bog stretching away on both sides, treeless, featureless, with low hills on the horizon that are more felt than seen after dark. The road sits slightly raised above the bog, like a causeway, which means that in wet weather, the standing water on either side reflects your headlights back at you, and it can feel like driving across a black lake on a narrow bridge. In daylight, it's bleak but manageable. After dark, with nothing ahead of you but the reach of your headlamps and nothing behind but whatever you've already passed, it becomes something else. My father described it as driving through the inside of a closed eye. The first trip was in late October. He loaded 20-odd ewes at Drummond's place in the late afternoon. Drummond was there to help. My father described him as the kind of older Highland farmer who communicates primarily through hand gestures and monosyllabic instructions, delivered at a volume meant for someone standing 50 yards away on a hillside. They got the sheep loaded. Drummond closed the trailer gate and bolted it. Then my father pulled out. He made it to the moor road at dusk. The last of the daylight was a thin orange band on the western horizon, and the road ahead was already dark enough to need headlights. The sheep in the trailer were settled, which was what you wanted. The ramp and the loading are the stressful parts, and once they're in and moving, they usually calm down. He drove the 12-mile stretch at a steady 40, which is about as fast as you'd want to push a loaded livestock trailer on a single track. About halfway across, he noticed the time. The 12 miles at 40 should take roughly 18 minutes, and he'd been driving for what felt like about that long. But the cattle grid at the far end of the moor, the landmark that meant you were off the open ground and dropping into the next glen, had not yet appeared. He checked his watch. 25 minutes. He wasn't worried yet, just mildly confused. He thought perhaps he had misjudged his start time, or maybe he had gone slower than he'd thought. Maybe both. So he kept driving. The cattle grid appeared after 47 minutes on this 12-mile road. My father was not a man who made errors about things like speed and distance. He had been driving professionally for the better part of a decade by then, and he could estimate his speed within a mile or two per hour without looking at the dial. He knew how long 12 miles took at 40. It didn't take 47 minutes. He shrugged it off as something odd and carried on to the destination farm. Because practical men like him, well, they archive things away, and they carry on. After all, there's no useful response to a road being longer than it should be. He unloaded at the receiving farm near Bewley. The farmer was a man called Geddes, and Geddes was waiting with the gate open and a torch in his hand, as it was past 7 by then and fully dark. They dropped the ramp and the sheep came out. The first 17 or 18 were fine. They trotted down the ramp and into the pen, in that stop-start uncertain way, like animals do when they're adjusting to solid ground after a moving floor. The last two, however, were limping. Both ewes, both favoring their front left leg, both with the same stiff, pained reluctance to put weight on it. And behind them, the last animal out, a ewe with a gash along her right flank that ran from just behind the shoulder almost to the hip. It was deep, deep enough that the flesh had parted, and you could see the pink of the muscle underneath. It was clean, almost surgically straight, as if it had been made with a blade, and not by an animal catching itself on some protruding edge. Geddes looked at the injuries, then at my father. My father said it wasn't quite an accusatory look he gave him, but certainly something that wanted explanation. Yet my father didn't have one. He had checked the trailer before loading, as he always did, and there was nothing in it that could produce a wound like that. Geddes cleaned the gash with iodine and wrapped it, and they agreed that the ewes must have knocked into each other during transit, which can happen when animals panic and scramble. Except these sheep had never panicked, not during the ride. They had been calm the entire way. My father had listened to the sounds of distress before. Stamping, bleating, the thud of bodies hitting the trailer walls, and had heard nothing on this trip. He drove home to Bewley and told my mother the delivery had gone fine. I mean, in the accounting of his mind, it had. Sheep sometimes arrive with injuries. Sometimes they have injuries as they load and you miss it. It was an imperfect business. He went to bed, he slept, and if he dreamed about anything, he didn't remember it in the morning. The second trip was 4 days later. The same route and the same time of day. Same conditions. An afternoon loading and a dusk departure that put him on the moor road after dark. This time he watched his clock from the moment his tires hit the single track. He drove at a careful, consistent 40, and he did not speed up or slow down, and he counted the minutes. The 12-mile crossing took 44 minutes, which at 40 miles per hour is a distance of just over 29 miles. The road was 12 miles long. He had just driven 29. He said nothing about this to anyone. It didn't make sense. He didn't want to dwell on it. Perhaps there was an error. If it was an error, it was not in his equipment, though. It had to be on the road. Perhaps the signs, perhaps something. He didn't know. At the Geddes farm, they unloaded. 3 ewes were injured this time, all with the same clean lacerations on the left side of the body, like something in the trailer was making a single cut across each animal at the same height and from the same direction. And there was one more, too. She was standing at the back of the trailer, facing the wall when they opened the gate. She didn't move when the others filed out, and when Geddes climbed in, coaxing her to turn around, he stepped back and said something under his breath in Gaelic that my father didn't catch. The poor thing's left eye was gone. The socket was open and empty and clean, like the eye had been lifted out by a surgeon, not torn or burst, and there was almost no blood. Maybe some thin, dry residue on the wool below the socket, but that's it. The ewe stood there and looked at them with her remaining eye, and she was calm. Entirely, horribly calm. My father wondered if it was adrenaline caused by the pain and fear. He and Geddes stood in the yard with a torch beam on that empty socket, and they didn't talk as they observed. Eventually, Geddes said it must have been a bolt, maybe a rough edge in the trailer, something the ewe had pressed her face against. My father knew every surface in that trailer down to the inch, and there was nothing that could do what had been done. He and Geddes both knew this, but neither of them said so out loud, and that knowing set between them like a stone. He drove home. He checked the trailer in the morning with a torch, running his hands over every surface, every join, and every bolt head. But he didn't find anything out of place. The interior walls were smooth, galvanized steel. The floor was clean. He couldn't even find blood anywhere, which itself was messed up. A wound like that especially, should have left blood on the floor, on the walls, or somewhere. The trailer was as clean as the day he had loaded it. That night he dreamed he was walking the moor road in the dark, on foot, alone. There was something behind him matching his pace step for step, with a half-second delay, so that each of his footfalls produced an echo that was not quite an echo, as it came from the wrong direction. He walked for hours, and the road did not end. He woke up in his bed, with his heart going a mile a minute, and my mom asleep beside him. He told himself it was a dream. Then he went downstairs and found his work boots by the front door, with black peat mud on the soles. He stood there in the kitchen in the early light and looked at those boots. You see, he did not own peat land, and he had not gone outside as far as he could remember. My father nearly refused the third run. He phoned Drummond and said he was busy, which was a lie. November was slow, and he had no other contracts that week. Drummond offered more money, and my father said it wasn't the money. Drummond then cleared his throat and asked, "Your wife's expecting, isn't she?" And my father said yes. My mother was 6 months pregnant with me at the time, a detail I've never been able to sit comfortably with. Drummond then explained how he needed the work, and so offered him double the rate. My father said no, so Drummond said something else. My father repeated it to me in the hospital, exactly as he remembered it. And I'll do that for you as well. Drummond had said, "You've been across 3 times now, Alistair. Twice there, once back empty. That's 3 crossings of a road that wants 4. You think it matters whether you're driving it? You walked it last night in your sleep. It'll have you walking it every night until you finish what you started, or until it finishes for you." My father asked how Drummond knew about the walking, but he didn't answer that. Instead, he said, "Finish the contract. 4 loaded crossings, that's a full drove. That's what the road wants. Leave it at 3, and that there's unfinished business. And that road has been collecting unfinished business since before your grandfather's grandfather was born." My father took the job. I don't know why. He didn't explain his reasoning to me, and I've spent 2 decades considering the possibilities, and I still can't settle on one. The money was part of it. We were not well off, and a baby was coming. Double rate for a day's work was not something he could dismiss easily. But obviously it was more than that. I think Drummond's mention of the sleepwalking frightened him in such a way. It confirmed that what was happening was not contained to the road. It was following him home. The peat on his boots, the dreams, the road reaching into his house while he slept. If Drummond was right, then driving the road again was not adding to the danger. The danger was already present, accumulating, and the only way to discharge it was to complete the crossing. Give the road what it wanted. He loaded the 3rd batch at Drummond's farm on a gray afternoon in the 2nd week of November. The sky was low and flat. The highland was overcast, making it impossible to tell where the sun was or how much light you had left. And the darkness, when it came, arrived without a transitional period. 1 minute, the moor was visible in washed-out gray, and the next, the headlights were cutting tunnels through solid black. He was on the moor road by 4:45. At mile 6, confirmed by his odometer, which he was now checking obsessively, he saw the figure. It was on the road ahead of him, walking the left-hand edge in the same direction he was traveling. His headlights picked it up at about 100 yards. The outline of a person, tall, wearing what appeared to be a long coat, hunched forward under the weight of something draped across his shoulders. The posture was that of a man carrying a heavy load, bent at the waist, arms raised to grip whatever was slung behind his neck. My father's first thought was that it was a stalker, not what you'd think when you hear the word stalker, but rather a deer hunter coming off the hill with a carcass. You carry a deer across your shoulders with the legs hanging down your chest, and from behind in poor light, that's approximately what this looked like. He slowed the truck. The road was single track and there was no room to pass without the figure stepping aside, so he dropped to walking pace and flashed his headlights. The figure, though, did not react. He tapped his horn, a short bleat that sounded enormous in the moorland silence, but no response. The figure kept walking at the same pace. My father rolled along behind it at 5 miles per hour, with his headlights fully on its back, and so more details began to resolve. The coat was long past the knees, and it was not a modern garment. My father said it looked heavy and shapeless, like rough wool or oilskin that you see in old photographs of agricultural workers from a century ago. The figure moved wrong too, stiff and repetitive, like the legs beneath the coat were operating on a mechanism, not through muscular intent. Each step was identical to the last in length and timing, no variation, no adjustment for the camber of the road or the rough surface. This was not like a living man's walk, constantly adapting to the ground beneath them. This was a walk that had been fixed and placed, and was simply repeating. The thing across its shoulders was no deer. The legs hanging down the figure's chest, my father could see them clearly now in the headlights, swaying with each step, were too thin and ended in small cloven hooves, and there were too many of them. He counted at least 4 distinct legs, possibly 6, layered over each other, which meant the figure was carrying more than one animal. Sheep. Dead sheep. Draped and stacked across its shoulders, and it was walking the Drove Road at 5 o'clock on a November night, as though this were a task it had been performing for a very long time, and intended to perform for a great deal longer. My father stopped the truck. He told me he didn't know why he did. Every functioning part of his brain was telling him to accelerate and get clear of this, but his foot went to the brake, and his hands went still. He sat in the idling cab with his headlights on the figure 20 yards ahead. He couldn't look away from it, and he couldn't move. He said it was like the road was holding him there, like he was trapped in some unseen current. Some unseen force had interposed itself and had told him to wait. The sheep in the trailer then started screaming. My father used that word specifically, and I'll use it here. He was a man who had spent his adult life around livestock. He knew the full range of sounds they make, and what came out of that trailer was not bleating and was not distress calls. It was a sound he had never heard from sheep before, and he said it was the sound of animals who knew, in whatever limited way that sheep could know anything, that something was present that was fundamentally incompatible with their being alive. The sound broke whatever was holding him. He released the brake, put the truck in second, and floored the accelerator. The Bedford lurched past the figure on the narrow road, doing 50 on a surface that was barely safe at 30. As he passed, he looked to his left through the driver's side window, and the figure was there, close enough that he could have reached out and touched it if the glass hadn't been between them. He saw its face then. My father described this once. Back in that hospital bed with his eyes on the ceiling, his voice perfectly steady, and his free hand gripping the bed rail so hard that the tendons rose up through the skin like cables. When he was done describing it, he closed his eyes and didn't open them for a full minute. I sat there and listened to his breathing apparatus cycle, and I didn't say a word. The face had been a man's face. My father was certain of this. The underlying structure was human, the proportions were human. The basic architecture of brow and cheekbone and jaw was that of a grown man. But the flesh over that structure had been transformed in a way that my father could only compare to the photographs he'd seen of bog bodies pulled from peat. The skin darkened to a deep reddish brown, compressed tight against the skull, shrunk and hardened by acid and time until it was less skin than leather. The lips drawn back from the teeth in a permanent, involuntary grimace, the sockets deep and shadowed. Peat preserved, tanned by centuries in the ground. The ground tans everything it keeps long enough. The eyes in those sockets were open. They were wet and they moved. They tracked the truck as it passed, and my father said that in the half-second he saw them, he understood that the face was dead, but that the eyes were not. That contradiction was the worst part. Something was looking out of that face that had no business being behind dead eyes, and it saw him clearly. And yet it was not surprised to see him there. He drove the remaining 6 miles without slowing down. His odometer recorded the distance as 9. He was past questioning this by then. At the Geddes farm, they opened the trailer. 14 of the 15 sheep walked out in good order. The 15th was at the back of the trailer, at the far corner, and it wasn't standing up. Now I must describe what my father described to me, and I'll do it plainly, though it is bizarre and disturbing. The ewe was on its side. It was definitely alive. My father could see its ribcage moving, shallow but rapid breathing. Its eyes were open, and its legs were making small rhythmic paddling motions, like a dying animal's legs moving as the nervous system fails. But the animal was not dying from any wound or impact. Well, nothing that made sense anyway. You see, its abdomen had been opened up. The skin and wool of the belly had been parted along a line so clean and straight, it looked measured, from the sternum to the pelvis, and the 2 flaps of skin had been folded back, laid flat against the ground on either side of the body, like the pages of some book. The interior of the animal was exposed. Organs, musculature, the architecture of a living sheep presented in cross-section, as though for a veterinary demonstration. The organs had been rearranged. The stomach and intestines, which should have been in the abdominal cavity, had been drawn out and placed on the exterior of the body in positions that corresponded roughly to where they would sit if the animal's inside and outside had been reversed. The liver was where the wool should have been. The wool was underneath. Everything was in the wrong place but arranged with intent. Something with horrible creativity had opened this animal up and tried to put it back together according to a different set of instructions. Somehow, the ewe was breathing through all of this. Its legs were still paddling. Its eye, the one my father could see, was open and looking at nothing. My father and Geddes stood at the back of that trailer in the dark farmyard with a single torch beam on the poor animal, and neither of them said a word. My father said they stood there for minutes, which feels like years when you're standing in silence, looking at something impossible. Geddes then climbed into the trailer, cutting the ewe's throat with his penknife. The breathing stopped. The legs stopped. And that was that. They dragged the remains out of the trailer, burying them behind the farm buildings in the dark, working by torchlight. When the hole was filled and the ground stamped flat, Geddes stuck his spade in the earth, leaning on it, and said, "Don't bring any more animals down that damned road." My father explained that he still had one more trip. Geddes gave him a look and said, "My father used to haulage sheep before me, and his father before him. Nobody in my family drives after dark on the moor road, and I'd suggest you arrive at the same policy." He picked up his spade and walked away. My father drove home. He didn't sleep well that night. In fact, he first stayed in the kitchen in the dark with a cup of tea, sort of just listening to the house. He tried to find a way to make what he had seen fit into a normal world, but he failed to do so. The days after the 3rd trip were the part of the story my father told with the least detail. I think this was not because nothing happened, but because what happened was personal, and even on his deathbed, there were things he didn't want to hand down to his son. He said he felt different, that food had lost its familiar taste. Even the reflection in the bathroom mirror seemed delayed or lagged by the smallest fraction of a second, but he could feel it. And he had dreams every night. The moor road, footsteps behind him, the walk that didn't end, and every morning, the boots were by the door with fresh peat on the soles. My mother noticed. She was not an easily frightened woman. but my father said she had begun watching him with a quality of attention associated with waiting rooms. Patient, alert, braced for any kind of news. One evening she told him he smelled different. He asked what she meant. She said she could not describe it, except that it wasn't him. The smell of his very skin had changed, and she looked afraid, likely because my father wasn't sick. And if he was, that would be treatable. This wasn't. Drummond eventually called. One more trip, the final batch. 15 U's, finish the contract, finish the drove, and be done. My father said yes. Drummond's warning was the last thing my father heard before he pulled out of the farm track onto the B road for the final time. They'd loaded the 15 U's in near silence, working quickly in the afternoon light, and as my father climbed into the cab, Drummond put his hand on the doorframe, and he held it there so that the door couldn't close. He looked my father dead in the eye, and he said, "Don't stop. Whatever you see on that road, don't stop the truck. If it stalls, you stay in the cab. Do not put your feet on that road after dark." My father asked what would happen if he did. Drummond took his hand off the doorframe and said, "Then you'll join the drove." He stepped back, and my father closed the door. That was the last time the two men spoke. It was 3:30 when he reached the B road. Sunset was at 4:30. 12 miles at 45 would take 16 minutes. He would be off the moor and through the cattle grid with daylight to spare. My father said he felt something close to optimism as he turned onto the single track, which tells you how far his calibration had shifted over the preceding weeks. That the prospect of driving a road that had mutilated livestock and put living eyes in a dead man's face could produce anything resembling relief. But he had daylight, and he had speed, and he had an engine that had never let him down. In 16 minutes, it should be over. The moor opened up on either side as the road climbed away from the glen. Brown peat, gray sky, hills on the horizon just visible through a thin haze. He set his speed at 45 and watched the odometer and drove. At mile 3, the sky changed. The overcast, which had been a uniform gray sheet all day, thickened and dropped. This man had driven through highland squalls and hill fog, even through horizontal rain so bad it reduced visibility to the length of the bonnet. But this was strange. The light simply left. No fade whatsoever. The light was simply removed. He checked his watch. 3:50. The sunset should not have been for another 40 minutes. The dark had come early, and it came all at once. There was nothing natural about this. He pressed his accelerator. The engine responded, but the truck felt heavy suddenly, sluggish, laboring, like it was having trouble pulling the additional weight of the trailer now. The temperature gauge, which normally sat comfortably in the middle third of its range, began to climb. He was doing 45 by the speedometer, but the sensation of speed was wrong too. The road ahead unspooled in his headlights at a pace that felt closer to 30. Mile 6. The halfway point on a 12-mile road, except by now he had no faith that that road was 12 miles. He drove and he watched the odometer count, and he kept his hands tight on the wheel. The sheep in the trailer stayed silent. He had been listening for them since the start of the drive, but he'd heard nothing. Over a dozen animals standing in a metal box in a moving vehicle eventually produced some sound, but these were producing nothing. It had been so completely quiet behind him that if he hadn't loaded them himself an hour earlier, he could have believed that the trailer was empty. Mile 9. No cattle grid. The moor road continued ahead of him, straight and featureless, the headlights reaching maybe 80 yards before the dark swallowed them. The temperature gauge was nudging the red. The engine note had changed from the steady diesel thrum that he knew as well as his heartbeat to something strained and arrhythmic, a machine working against a resistance which it was not designed for. He checked the wing mirror on the driver's side. A habit of his. A haulier does this every few minutes without thinking about it. There, in the red wash of the taillights, at the furthest edge of what the glow could reach, there were shapes on the road behind him. They were low and pale, moving in a loose formation that spread across the width of the road and the verges on either side. Sheep. There were sheep on the road behind his trailer, following him across the moor, and there were far more of them than the 15 he was carrying. He could see dozens. They filled the road from edge to edge and extended back beyond the reach of his taillights into a darkness that could have contained any number more. They were walking at the same pace as his truck, keeping a steady distance, and even in the dim red light and the small shaking rectangle of the wing mirror, he could see that they were not normal. Like that figure from before, they moved stiffly and uniformly, every animal moving in the same rhythm, legs working in lockstep that normal sheep would never do. Some of them were even walking on legs that were bent oddly, which would make it impossible for a living animal to stand on, let alone move with. One near the front of the flock, where the tail light was strongest, had its head hanging sideways from a clearly broken neck. The skull was resting against its own shoulder, and it walked the same steady pace as the rest. Their wool was dark and matted, with something that looked like mud but wasn't, and the ones closest to the light had a quality to their bodies that my father struggled to articulate that I will try to convey as precisely as I can. They looked compressed, flattened, as though they had been subject to enormous pressure that had pushed them into a denser version of themselves, the way peat pushes everything into a tighter, darker, more preserved form. My father faced forward and put his foot down. The engine screamed, the speedometer read 50, but that road was not meant for 50. The truck shuddered and swayed, and he held the wheel with both hands, determined to keep driving, due to what Drummond had told him, and because looking in that mirror again was something that he could not bring himself to do. Mile 14. There was no cattle grid still. The road should have ended 2 miles ago by any honest measurement, and it had not ended. The engine temperature was in the red, and the needle was still climbing. My father could smell hot metal and coolant, and he knew that the truck was about to die, and there was nothing he could do about it. It died at mile 15. Like a dying man's pulse, the engine stopped. Mid-beat, total, without the courtesy of a gradual failure. The truck rolled forward on its remaining momentum, slowing, and came to a rest on the empty road, with the headlights dimming to amber on battery power, and the dark closing in from every direction, like water filling a hole. He sat in the cab. He did not try the ignition. He knew the engine was gone, and he understood that turning the key would drain the battery faster, and the headlights were the only thing between him and absolute darkness. He wanted them for as long as they would last. The cab was cooling rapidly. The heater had died with the engine, and the November cold came in through the glass and the floor and the doors. Yet underneath that cold was the other cold, the one he'd felt on the moor road from the first trip. Wet and organic, carrying the smell of deep peat, the smell of ground full of dead things. In the wing mirror, the flock had stopped. They stood on the road behind the trailer in a dense, still mass, and in the fading taillight, they almost looked like ordinary sheep if you kept your focus soft and did not look too closely. My father did not examine them closely either. He glanced once, then he faced forward, placing his hands on the wheel as he waited. The flock parted. He heard that part rather than saw it. The sound of hooves on tarmac shifting to either side, pressing to the verges to open a path through their center. And through that center, at a pace that matched the mechanical rhythm of the flock's walking, came the sound of footsteps. Heavy steps, accompanied by a wet, dragging sound underneath, as though this new figure was leaving a trail on the road surface. The footsteps passed along the left side of the trailer, close enough that my father could hear the brush of the long coat against the metal sidewall. And then they were alongside the truck. Then they were alongside the cab, and then they stopped outside the driver's door. My father didn't look. He stared through the windshield at the last pale cone of his failing headlights on the empty road ahead. He kept his hands on the wheel, and he didn't turn his head. He could hear it, though. Hear it standing there inches from the glass, the sound of its breathing thin and papery. Beneath the breathing, he could hear other smaller sounds. The faint creak of the weight across its shoulders shifting, the slow drip of something landing on the tarmac below, the soft wet contact of the dead sheep's hooves swaying against the figure's chest. And it stood there for so long. But my father didn't count. He said that time lost its structure, because when you're in a situation like that, time loses its meaning. The only way he knew time was truly passing was the fact that the headlights were still getting dimmer, and that the cold was getting deeper. He gripped the wheel, and he did not look at it. He did not speak to it. He refused to move. Suddenly, the glass made a sound, a high and thin sound, like something hard being drawn down a smooth surface. My father kept his eyes forward, but he could see it in his peripheral vision. The movement on the driver's side window, the dark shape at the glass. The sound continued, a slow downward stroke, from the top of the window to the bottom. Then another, parallel to the first, and another. 4 strokes altogether, 4 lines or grooves being inscribed into the exterior of the glass by something that was not a fingernail, and was not a tool, and was, as far as my father's peripheral vision could tell, the tip of a bare, dark, and hardened finger. The sound stopped. The breathing continued for a few more seconds, but then the footsteps resumed, moving past the cab, past the bonnet, and now onto the road ahead. The dragging sound went with it, and the flock on the verges began to move, falling in line behind the figure. The whole procession, the shepherd and his dead drove, walked north along the moor road until the sound of their passage faded and the night was silent. My father was alone. He waited, maybe 5 minutes. He could not have waited longer because his body was shaking with a violence that made it difficult to keep his hands on the wheel, and the cold had gotten into him, touching his very core. He turned the key, and the engine started right away, turning over on the first attempt with a healthy, steady note. It was like the dang thing had never stopped. The headlights brightened, the temperature gauge sat in the middle of its range, and the cab began to warm up. He put the truck in gear and drove. The cattle grid appeared less than 2 miles later, exactly where the map said it should be, and he crossed it, and the road dropped into the glen, and the moor was behind him. He did not look back. At the Geddes farm, the farmer had agreed to receive this final batch despite what he'd said before. My father never explained how that arrangement had been made. They opened the trailer. 14 sheep came out, healthy, uninjured, and calm. 14, not 15. The trailer was sealed, bolted from the outside. There was no gap or breach anywhere in its construction, nowhere for a 60-kilogram animal to leave through. 14 sheep walked into the pen, and the 15th simply did not exist. There was no body, no blood, no wool, and no hoofprint. There was no indication that a 15th animal had ever been in the trailer at all. Geddes counted twice. So did my father. 14. Geddes looked at my father across the pen gate, and my father looked back. Geddes took out his delivery book, signed the receipt for 15, and put the book away. He closed the pen and walked toward his house without turning around. My father drove home to Bewley in the dark with the heater on full and the radio playing. His hands were steady on the wheel, and his mind was blank. He parked outside his house and sat in the cab for a while before finally going inside. He didn't check the trailer. He never checked that trailer again. He never drove that moor road again either. The contract was finished. Drummond never called, and my father never inquired. He learned years later and secondhand that Drummond had been found dead on the moor road in the spring of 1979. They found him sitting upright against a fence post with his crook across his lap, dead of exposure on a night when the temperature had not dropped below 7 degrees. The man who told my father about this said Drummond looked like he had been sitting there for a long time, though the pathologist report put the death at only a few hours before the body was found. My father received this information, said nothing, and changed the subject. Those changes my father dealt with, well, they faded. The dreams stopped within a month or so. The peat mud stopped appearing on his boots. The strange thing about his reflection even settled. My mother stopped watching him, and the smell she had noticed went away. By the time I was born in February of 1973, my father was, by all external measures, the same man he'd been before the contract. He went back to work. He hauled livestock for another 28 years, and he never spoke about what happened, never drove that road. But he was a different man. But because I grew up inside that difference, I wasn't able to name it myself. But I knew that he flinched at dead animals on the roadside. Not the typical grimace that you might make, but a full-body recoil, a jerk of the head away, as though the sight was physically painful. He wouldn't walk on unpaved ground after dark, which in the rural highlands is a significant constraint. And if circumstances forced it, he moved with a rigid, mechanical haste that I now recognize as a man trying to spend as little time as possible with his feet on open earth. He kept the radio on every waking hour in every room he occupied, a low and continuous murmur of voices and music that didn't really serve an entertainment purpose. He really didn't listen to it himself. It was just sound to fill the quiet, made him feel less alone. A few years after he died, I flew out to visit my mom, and I went to look at the truck. The Bedford was still in the barn where he'd parked it after his last job, covered in dust and pigeon droppings, but structurally intact. I opened the cab door and sat in the driver's seat. I mean, my father had spent more hours in that seat than in any chair in our house. There was something of him still in the worn vinyl, and the position of the mirrors, and the faint smell of diesel and livestock. I looked at the driver's side window. The scratches were still there. 4 vertical lines scored into the exterior surface, running from the top to the bottom, deep enough to catch a fingernail when I ran my hand across them on the outside. These weren't cracks. They weren't random marks of road debris or scraped branches. They were a warning, and they were proof that my dad's story was more true than I liked to believe. I feel like roads can be haunted like houses can be haunted, but one seems far worse. If you're trapped in a haunted house, you cover your head, you ignore the ghosts, and you wait for dawn. But a haunted road, well, you're at the mercy of the infinite darkness, my friend, and whatever lurks within it. Good night. Thank you all so much for tuning into this episode of Tales from the Break Room. I'm your host, Darkness Prevails. You can send me your scary work-related stories at eeriecast.com/submit. You can also find this show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or the YouTube channel, Darkness Prevails. Till next time, everyone, I've got to clock out, but I'll be back again real soon.
Welcome to Dead and Roasted. What can I get you?
The following story lacks evidence beyond the claims made within. Enjoy, but consider it fictional until proper evidence arises. Tornadoes are the one thing on this planet that is the closest to being a real-life Lovecraftian nightmare. I mean, just look up pictures and videos of these things. These emotionless, giant tendrils that come down from the vast sky to alter the fates of all of us below. This story comes from a user named CV Man, who shares a terrifying traumatic event. You see, he was a storm chaser, and a certain storm in 1985 convinced him that tornadoes are sentient. Hey, I'm a storm chaser. I don't think I've heard any storm chaser stories on your channel so far, so I'm sending you this one. Until 2010, I was a storm chaser. But my hands are the reason I quit. My doctor diagnosed me with rheumatoid arthritis. It started in my thumbs around 2003, and by 2010 I couldn't hold a steering wheel through a hailstorm without my grip going out on me. And you can't chase storms like that. It's already a dangerous hobby. You don't want to make it harder on yourself and other people. Obviously, it also makes it harder to hold a camera, or perform emergency tasks like changing a tire on a county road when a wall cloud is 2 miles behind you. So in 2010, I sold my stuff and gave it up. That would have been 30 years of chasing storms. I thought it would be a massive vortex doing me in, but no, it was my own body. When I tell people that I was a storm chaser, the first things you'll hear are, "Oh, that's so cool," or "Oh, that's so dangerous," which is then followed by questions of my closest calls, or the craziest things I've ever seen. And I've got several of those stories, all good for a porch and a beer. But those aren't the stories I'm here to tell you about. Truth be told, my wife does not like me telling this story. And when I tell it, my son always says that I'm crazy. Because this was the experience that made me believe something I've never been able to talk about. Because this is the experience that made me believe something that I've never been able to talk myself out of. And to be quite forward with you, it's this. Some tornadoes are alive. Not all tornadoes. Most of them are just weather, dumb as a rock, doing what physics tells them to do. But some of them, they know exactly what they're doing, and some of them even know when you're looking at them. This happened in 1985. Back in 1985, the data on tornadoes was rough, to put it lightly. There was no radar you could look at unless you were sitting in a weather service office, and they weren't going to just invite anybody in. There was no internet and no phone in your pocket to tell you a storm was rotating 6 miles southwest of you. What there was the morning paper, the TV forecast at 6 and again at 10, an NOAA weather radio that squawked like a dying bird, and a CB in your truck. Everything else relied on your own eyes and whatever you'd taught yourself. I'd been chasing since 1980 by then, which made me one of the older hands in a hobby that barely existed at that point. There were some guys in Oklahoma doing it, some in Texas, a handful of university people. They would caravan out into the plains every spring, radioing each other and swapping film. But in Arkansas, well, from what I could tell back then, not really anybody chased in Arkansas. And there's good reason for that. Arkansas is a terrible place for chasing. You've got hills, hollows, timber, road systems laid out by cows instead of people. You could be nearly under a tornado and never see it. So the chasers went west where the money shots were, and I stayed home most of the time because home is where I was. I sold cars for a living. People get an idea in their head that a storm chaser was some kind of scientist. No, I was a car salesman at a car lot in our little town of a few thousand. I wore a clip-on tie and sold F-150s to farmers. But storms were the other half of me, the half that would get up at 4 in the morning in April to look at the dew point out the back door. My wife, Magdalene, understood me as best she could. She used to fight me about going out there and putting myself at risk, but around year 2 of chasing, she stopped fighting me, and instead packed me sandwiches. My son Samuel was 9 at the time. He wanted to come with me so bad it hurt. I told him when he's 13, he could ride along, but not till then. He told me he'd be waiting. But he never did get that ride along, and you'll find out why. Now this brings me to Caitlin. Caitlin was my brother Dixon's girl. She was 11 back then. She had leukemia and was diagnosed when she was 9. But the most significant part about that is that she won. She was winning. I know, you probably hear about a sick little girl in a story and start to brace yourself, but Caitlin was on the good side of that battle. She'd been through the worst of it, and by March of that year, the doctors were telling her parents that she was in remission. Dixon called me at the dealership that day. He was so dang happy, and I was happy too hearing the news. I remember smiling so wide I nearly cried. She would be going back to school in the fall. 5th grade, a year behind, and she didn't care about that. So we're not talking about a little girl who was fading away, but a girl who was coming back to life. Dixon and his wife Ruth Ann lived 4 miles outside of town, down in this little valley. You'd come off the highway onto some gravel, and the road would start to angle downwards. The hills would begin to close up on you on both sides, and you're driving into a bowl, basically, with a creek at the bottom. Their house sat on 6 acres at the low end, A cute little white house with a tin roof and a big front porch that Dixon had built himself. That man could be insufferable about all the stuff he could build with his hands. There was a hayfield across the road and woods on 3 sides. I went out there twice a week, sometimes 3. I'd bring Samuel with me, and we'd say the kids were going to play together, but that was a word we used for the adults' benefit. Caitlin would get winded going to the mailbox, so mostly Samuel would sit on the end of her bed or out on the porch swing, and the 2 of them would talk for 2 hours about, I'm not sure, probably school and pretend stuff. They were good together. She was older and treated him like a little brother, which he loved actually, and would have died before admitting it. She had an opinion about everything too, that girl. She'd tell you your shirt was ugly and then tell you she liked it ugly. That leads me to the nightmares. You see, a month before all of this, Caitlin began to have these nightmares. Ruth Ann told me about them. She was scared they meant something medical, some pressure thing on her brain or a reaction to what they'd been putting in her. But the doctors checked and checked over and over and everything looked good. But she just started to have them. A few nights a week, she'd come up screaming out of a dead sleep, like a night terror. Then she wouldn't be able to stop for a while after she was awake. I asked Caitlin once myself about her nightmares. I did it when her parents weren't around. Heck, I waited until Samuel was inside to grab a Coke. And I felt bad for asking, but I did. We were outside on the porch, just her and me. And I said, "So your mom tells me you've been having some bad dreams lately." She went kind of shy or embarrassed. Then she replied, "They're not really dreams." "No?" "Well, a dream is something your head makes up." She started to pick at the arm of the porch swing, chipping away at some already chipped paint. "These are like something that's there." "What do you mean?" "I see a man in the field." I looked out at the hayfield across the road. I couldn't help it, and I didn't see anyone there. I'd never seen anyone in there, actually, since Dixon bought the place. "So what's this man do?" I asked. "Nothing. He just stands there, and he points." "Does he point at anything?" "Yeah, he points at our house." I laughed. I didn't mean to laugh. I just thought it was silly. Just a random and kind of eerie dream that a kid might have. And I even told her that was one heck of a boring nightmare, teasing her, and I got a laugh out of her too. Samuel came back with a Coke for each of us, and we talked about something else. I've thought about that conversation constantly since this happened, and I feel so guilty for laughing. At the start of that work week, there was news that some severe weather would be happening soon. It came in on the 6 o'clock news out of Little Rock, Arkansas. A man said that a system was moving out of Texas, and there was a chance of severe thunderstorms Wednesday and Thursday. Chance. That's the cover word, which basically, especially at that time, meant we don't really know for sure, so good luck everybody. I don't mean to be a Debbie Downer, but back then forecasts were a guess drawn with crayons, basically. It covered half the state. Severe could mean pea-sized hail and a good gust, or it could mean the whole town getting picked up and set down in a different country. You really had to look at the sky yourself and make your own judgments. On Tuesday, I got up early and stood in the backyard in my robe, drinking some coffee. I read what I could on the newspaper, watched what I could on the TV, and then I did my own judgments. The air felt strange, like air that didn't belong in our season. It was thick and warm at 6 a.m., and a low wind out of the south didn't stop or start, but ran steadily and constantly, like something was pulling it in. I went to work at the car lot, and I could not concentrate worth a damn. I remember giving this farmer too good of a deal on a new Ranger because I was too busy watching the window. By that night, the TV man had moved the crayon. Thursday, he said now. Thursday afternoon and evening, and now he was using the phrase, all modes of severe weather possible. Great, so now he was covering all his bases. A weatherman's way of saying no takesies backsies. But it also meant he was worried. He was telling us to prepare for the worst. On Wednesday morning, when I came into work, I went right to my boss and I asked if I could have a day off on Thursday. My boss, Ledbetter, was a fat but decent old man who had been selling Fords since Eisenhower, and he knew me, He knew why I wanted off before I told him. I had asked him in the past for the same thing before, for the same reasons. Storm day? Storm day. He waved his hand at me. Take it. Work Saturday if you can. And just don't do it in one of our demos, okay? I laughed and said, okay, thank you. And I didn't. I chased in my own truck, a 1977 Bronco with a CB whip on the bumper, and a weather radio zip-tied to the dash. Because my mount had broken, I never fixed it. I had a Nikon and 4 rolls of film in the glove box and a box of county maps under the seat. The good ones from the highway department. They showed every gravel road and low-water crossing in the area. That was my radar, a box of paper maps and 5 years of guessing. On Wednesday night, I got the house ready. Magdalene was a big help. We had an interior hall closet, no windows, and we put in 2 couch cushions and a flashlight with fresh batteries. I also had my hard hat from a job I'd had at 19, just in case, for Samuel. But Samuel thought the hard hat was hilarious, because when he put it on, it came down over his eyes. Ha ha, but you put this on if you hear the siren, got it? Don't argue with your mother either, I told him. I know. Say it back. If we hear the siren, hall closet, hard hat, don't argue. That's right. Thank you. The siren, I should say, was a joke out here. Our town had one up on the water tower, but out at the edge of town on a windy day, you would have a lot of trouble hearing it. And for my brother's place, well, 4 miles out there and down in a bowl? No, they would never hear it. Magdalene stood in the kitchen doorway with a dish towel while I ran through the plan. We'd done this plenty of times before. What time are you leaving? Depends. Probably 11, close to noon. I want to get out ahead of it. Ahead of what? Nobody knows exactly what's going to happen. I grinned. That's true. That's the question. She sighed and folded the towel over twice before hanging it on the oven handle. I don't like this one. I've got a bad feeling, she said. Oh, honey, you don't like any of them. And I'd have a bad feeling too if you were doing it. I completely understand. No, you don't. She looked at me straight. I don't like this one. I kissed her on the side of the head and went out to the garage to check my tires. I remember standing there with a tire gauge in my hand, feeling something in my stomach that I thought at the time was excitement. That's the thing about chasing a storm that happens in your own backyard. Every chaser wants the big one. But then that big one happens over your hometown where your kid goes to school, where your wife buys groceries, and you find out that the wanting and the dreading are the exact same feeling. There was one more thing on top of that too, this dreadful sense of loneliness. Because there would be no one else with me. I would be alone, and more alone than you think. There would be no other storm chasers here, not that I was aware of. The Oklahoma guys were not driving 5 hours east into the trees for a marginal Arkansas setup. There wasn't going to be a caravan coming here. There would not be another person within 200 miles, I'd say, doing what I was doing. Whatever came down out of that sky on Thursday, if anything at all, I would be the only man in the state pointed at it on purpose. God help me, I was thrilled about it, and also a little nervous. Let me back up the story a little bit. Before that night, just in the evening, we went out to Dixon's, actually. I almost didn't. The air was feeling like something was about to happen, and I just wanted to be at home, to get ready, and to be ready. But Samuel had been on me about it since Sunday. He wanted to visit his cousin. Plus, Ruth Ann had made a chess pie. Dixon was in the yard when we pulled in. He was working on the gutter with a pair of pliers. Dixon being ever the handyman. I swear he'd been fixing something on that house every day since 1975. He was 2 years my senior, and about a foot more stubborn. Ruth Ann was inside grading papers. She taught 3rd grade at the elementary school in town, and every flat surface in that house had a stack of something on it from August to May. Caitlin was on the porch swing with a blanket over her legs, even though it was 75 degrees out. Even so, she looked great. Her hair was maybe 2 inches long and standing straight up, and she made peace with that. She'd put on weight, finally, which for a kid in her situation was a victory. That little girl deserved a parade. So we ate some chess pie. Dixon and I argued about a football game from 4 years ago. Samuel and Caitlin ended up on the porch, and they stayed out there for a while. Through the screen door, I could hear the two of them going back and forth, and every so often we'd hear a laugh. Before we left, I stood in the doorway with Dixon, and I told him about the forecast. They're saying tomorrow afternoon, all right? Could be bad, so be on the lookout, I told him. They said that last month, he replied. I know what they said last month, and I'm telling you what I think. Dang, that bad, huh? I shook my head. I don't know for sure. Could be nothing. But if the sky goes green tomorrow, don't stand in the yard staring. Keep that culvert in mind. There was a concrete culvert pipe at the low end of the property, left over from when the land was farmland. It was 4 feet across and dry. That's the best they had. That house had no basement, and neither did 9 out of 10 houses in that town. I got the culvert, he said. But Ray, we already live in a hole in the ground already, referring to the valley they were in. Tornado's not coming down the hollow. I wish that's how it worked, but it's not, I told him. Well, I think that's how it's always worked. He was kind of right in that most people back then believed that. Every person in every hollow in the state believed it. They would tell you that tornadoes can't climb mountains, so they can't get to the valleys within. I let it go. We said our goodbyes. Ruth Ann sent us some pie home in foil. Caitlin gave me her biggest hug yet on the porch, and reminded me that she loved my ugly shirt, so I couldn't get rid of it. Then Samuel and I got in the truck and drove out. Samuel, though, I noticed, was quiet for the first mile out. Samuel at 9 years old was a geological event. That kid would never shut up. But eventually he did say something. Caitlin was so weird today, he said. What kind of weird you talking about, boy? Now don't be mean to your cousin. No, not bad weird, he explained, but happy. Is being happy a crime now? No, that's not what I mean. He put his hand out the window and played with the air as it rushed by. She was just really, really happy and quiet. She hardly said much the whole time. She sat there smiling and looking at stuff and laughing about stuff I said. Really, she only said one thing the whole time. And what did she say, bud? He pulled his hand back into the truck. Well, I asked her if she was okay, and all she said was, I've been ready for a while. I looked over at him. Yeah, I know I should have been watching the road. Ready for what? What did she mean? That's what I said, but she just smiled. She didn't say anything else about it. We drove another quarter mile, quiet, but then he said, Dad, is she getting sick again? Now, I probably made a mistake here, because when he said that, I thought he meant that he was scared she was dying. I thought he'd heard some making peace thing from Caitlin, so I told him clearly, no, she was doing better than she'd done in 2 years. I reassured him that she would be okay, and that was the doctors talking, not just me. When I said that, I felt like I was saying it to myself too, as if I also needed that reminder. But I kept on wondering, what did she mean? What was she ready for? Thursday, May 9th, 1985. I woke up at 4:30, and I could feel it right away, even in the house. Pressure and humidity. That morning my whole body was hollering, a storm is coming. I went out the back door in my robe and stood in the yard. It was 71 degrees out, and so humid the grass was wet without any dew having fallen yet. The wind was coming out of the south-southeast and already moving quick, a bad sign if you don't like severe weather. By 6 a.m., the weather radio already had a severe thunderstorm watch out for the southwest corner of the state. A watch means the conditions are right, but nothing yet has happened. 10 minutes later, that same corner got a severe thunderstorm warning, which means it has officially become a severe thunderstorm. In this case, there was hail coming down in that area. That was 2 hours away from me at the moment. I listened carefully to that flat computer voice reading out counties, and I felt my hands go cold. Magdalene made eggs. Then Samuel came in and ate his standing up. That boy was always in too much of a hurry or had too much energy, so my wife would make him sit down, which she did this time. This is all to say that that day was an ordinary morning. Before he left for school, Samuel asked me if I could get him a picture. "Yep, that's the plan, bud," I told him. "Dad, get a good one, not like last time," he said. "A good one, okay. I promise," I replied. He got on the bus at 7:15 a.m. Caitlin wasn't back in school yet, so she would still be at home. At 8 a.m., I called Dixon from the kitchen phone. Ruth Ann answered. I could hear the radio going in the background, and someone eating from a bowl. "Hey, Ruth Ann, can I talk to Dixon?" I asked. "He's putting Vince up on the back line. Want me to run and get him?" "No, that's okay. Just tell him that this afternoon is getting bad. Storm should be here by 2 or 3 o'clock, probably. So tell him to keep the radio on, and don't be too far from that culvert, any of you." "Oh, now you're scaring me a little, Ray." "Good," I said, then felt bad for how that sounded. "I'm sorry, just trying to look out for the family. And that culvert is the best setup you guys got. This doesn't mean something's gonna happen here. It's a big state. Just precautions." "Well, I've got school till 3, then." "Then that's perfectly fine. You'll be in the safest building in the county, I swear. Is, Caitlin there?" "Yeah, but she's sleeping. She had a rough night." "Another one?" "Worst one yet." She lowered her voice. "She was up at 2 and she wouldn't lie back down. She sat in the kitchen with the light on until 4 in the morning." "Did she say anything?" "Oh, Ray, she's talking about a man in the field. Said he moved. She's saying now he's not in the field anymore, he's in the road. Ray, I don't know what to do with this. The doctors won't even talk about it. They just want to do their normal tests on her." "So he's in the road now," I said, mostly to myself. I thought for a second, then followed up. "Look, Ruth, I'll come by tomorrow to check on everybody, okay? You have a good day at school. Stay safe." I hung up, and as I did, I was thinking at that moment, that's probably what 2 years of hospital stays does to a child's head, combined with the idea that she knew she was going to die, which she isn't now, but the damage is done, to her mental state. I went out to the garage and loaded my film, checking the oil in my truck. At 11:40 a.m., I pulled out. The plan was to go west and a little south, get on some high ground. If it was going to come, it was going to come from that way. There's an old fire road off the highway on Mabry Ridge, where you can see 20 miles west, well, on a normal day, and today was not a normal day. But here's what I saw at 12:15 p.m. To the west, there was a line of cumulus clouds going up. Not a wall of them, but individual towers spaced out. It looked like their tops were boiling over. Storms with that much room don't have to share. The base of the sky under those towers of clouds was the color of a nickel. I was sitting on the hood of my truck drinking a Coke. I watched the sky for a straight hour, and I was, I'll admit it, having the time of my life. Around 1:30 a.m., the tops of those clouds began to flatten out. They started to smear off to the east, way up high, like kitchen smoke hitting the ceiling. You see, air gets colder the higher you go, and warm air keeps climbing only as long as it's warmer than whatever it's pushing through. Somewhere around 40,000 feet, that quits being true, and the air up there starts getting warmer instead. A storm climbs into that and stops dead because there's nothing left to lift it, so it starts to spread out sideways, and the wind drags it downwind. That's the infamous anvil. And on 2 of those towers I could see a lump pushed up above the flat part, which is a storm hitting that ceiling hard enough to dent it before it gets shoved back down. What I was witnessing was real energy. The wind on the ground had swung around to the southeast. It was strong enough I could feel it moving my truck, and it was warm and wet, running straight toward those towers. I could feel the air around me being pulled past me, building into something out there. And it truly felt like I was standing at the edge of a building colossus. At 2 o'clock, the weather radio finally caught up to where I was. Now they reported a tornado watch on my county and 8 others, which was supposed to last till 9 that night. At 2:40, the first tornado warning of the day came in, 2 counties west, which meant somebody had either seen one or seen something on radar that looked enough like one. So I got in the truck, excited and nervous as hell. I drove down the ridge, going west on the highway, to get to the storm before it got to me. I wanted to stay southeast of this thing. Always. That's where I could see it good, and where I'd be able to get the heck out of Dodge. The storm I picked up was the middle one of the three, and by the time I got a look at the base of it, I knew I'd picked the right one. It was rotating, not so subtly. The whole underside was churning. One corner of it had sagged down lower than the rest, and was scooping up the loose torn cloud underneath it. I pulled over near a bridge, grabbed my camera, and spent half the film I had. My hands were steady though, despite the wind, but they would not be that steady much longer. The hail started then. Dime and nickel-sized hail. I was 4 steps away from the truck before it went to full golf ball size. I put an arm over my head and ran, and my dumb self slipped on the gravel alongside the driver's door, and I felt and heard a crash at my hand. I climbed in and got the door shut and looked down. The Nikon I'd been holding in my hand I'd used to catch myself in the fall, so it smacked the ground. The back had sprung open and was hanging off one hinge, and the film had pulled out of the canister. The prism housing was caved in on the corner. The wind-on lever turned and didn't do anything. Great. I broke one of the reasons I was out here. I had 4 unopened rolls in the glove box, and nothing on God's earth to put them in. I was mad. Ooh, that was the maddest I've ever been, and I had no one to blame but myself. There were tornadoes possibly on the ground, and I was sitting there mad instead of scared. The best storm I've ever gotten to see, and I smashed my camera. Then I thought of the promise I made Samuel, and I cursed out loud. That was adding insult to injury, because now I'd broken that promise by accident. 2 minutes later, the hail got even bigger, and the noise inside my Bronco was like being inside a snare drum. Suddenly, a big piece of ice shot through my windshield, leaving a hole the size of a quarter. I drove east, driving through the worst of rain and hail I've ever seen, and I came out the other side, where the world went quiet. God, that's eerie. Nothing says something bad is about to happen more than the world going quiet. That's when I saw the birds. There were about 50 birds. Blackbirds, grackles, something like that. And they were all flying west, into the storm. And they weren't being scattered or blown by the wind. They were in a formation, flying straight into the blackest part of that wall cloud. I've been around birds and weather my whole life. They're smart creatures with extra warning. They fly away before humans even know what's going on. And that was the only time I've seen them flying towards the danger. In all my years, I never saw that again. I watched them go in, and I didn't see them come out. Chasing storms at close range with very bad light. Your eyes can lie to you. The clouds begin to take shapes that you want to give it, instead of what it actually is. People, animals, buildings. I knew that back then. It had fooled me 100 times, and I'd learned never to trust anything I saw for less than 3 seconds. At 3:05, I was going down this old back road, about 1.5 miles east of the wall cloud, which is the big lowered block of cloud that tornadoes love to drop out of. The trees gave way to a soybean field, so I decided to pull over again. The wall cloud was southwest of me, but it was turning quickly, getting turbulent at the bottom. Lightning was constant in the back of the storm, and every couple of seconds the field would light up green-white, then go dark again. On the 3rd or 4th flash, I swear to God, there was a man standing in the middle of the soybean field, couple 100 yards out, facing me, arms down at his sides. Then it went dark again. I waited for the next flash of lightning, and there he was still, but now one arm was up. He was pointing east-northeast, past my truck, and off to my left. I hollered something out loud, but I don't remember what it was. I grabbed my binoculars and looked through them, waiting for the next flash. But when it came, there was no one in that field anymore. Just soybeans. I put the binoculars down, saying out loud, "What in the world?" Lo and behold, the storm turned east-northeast about 4 minutes later, where the man had been pointing. I know, a storm's gonna go the way it wants, not where a man is pointing. That's what I was thinking at the time. What a weird coincidence. I still can't believe that I didn't connect that man to Caitlin's dreams. until much later. At 3:12, the tornado came down. I saw the entire thing start to finish. Usually you get there and it's already down, or you're behind trees or a mountain, and all you might ever see is a gray wall. But I saw a hook of cloud come down off the southwest corner, spinning, and under it on the ground a ring of dust and trash kicked up. The ground vortex and the cloud met in the middle. That part took about 45 seconds. And when they met, the full thing condensed all at once from the center out. It was gray-white and thin at first, like a rope. I remember thinking it might be a skinny one, and this would all be done in 3 minutes. It wasn't. About a minute and a half later, it went from a rope shape to a cone, and from a cone to a full-on wedge, and by then I could hear it. And let me tell you, when people say it sounds like a train, it does not sound like a train. A train is rhythmic. This was a flat-out roar that never changed pitch, a sound so low and high at the same time, I could feel it in my very bones. And hearing it that close for the first time, I did not like it. I reached inside my truck for my camera, then remembered it had been destroyed. So I stood there and I watched the most spectacular and terrifying phenomenon. What I did not expect to see were the tendrils. Listen closely, this part is documented, and any meteorologist will tell you the same. Big tornadoes aren't usually one tornado. They are strong ones that develop smaller vortices around the main circulation, suction vortices, that whip around the inside of the wall. That's why you'll see one house flattened and the one beside it barely touched. It's not the tornado being choosy, it's those things carving up the ground as they go around. And sometimes, in a really strong one, they don't stay vertical. They can tilt over. You'll get one lying almost flat, coming out of the side of the funnel and curling around it. There's film of this from Oklahoma and Kansas. Look it up and prepare to be terrified. So when I tell you that at 3:20 in the afternoon I watched that tornado put out arms, I want you to know that the physics back me up. But knowing the physics does not prepare you for seeing them. There were 4 or 5 of these tendrils. They came out of the side wall horizontally. They had to be 20, maybe 30 feet thick, and each extended out 100 yards, maybe 200, curling and feeling along the ground. One of them touched down for a moment at a patch of trees, and I watched that patch get erased. That's what it looked like to me from 1.5 miles away. It looked like something reaching out and touching things to see what they are, only to disintegrate them. One of these tendrils came out of the north side and went out over an open pasture, and it stopped, hanging there and turning. There was nothing out there for it to do. It hung for 8 to 10 seconds, then drew back in. I lowered my binoculars, and I could feel my stomach turning even more. Around 3:25, the rain thickened, taking my visibility with it, so I had to reposition. That's where I made my first awful decision. Instead of driving south, I ran through a gravel road east, trying to beat it to the next hard road. The gravel turned to mud, and before I knew it, I was going uphill. It took much longer than expected going through there on 4-wheel low. My back end was sliding and the roar was getting louder behind me. I was scared the tornado would be on top of me, and I would never see it coming. When I finally made it back out onto pavement, I was way closer to it than I wanted to be, only 800 yards. I came out onto a blacktop road with a fence line on my right. The tornado was right there off my left shoulder, so I stopped the truck right there in the middle of the road. There was nothing I could do at that moment. My legs were trembling so hard I could barely drive. The engine was running and the wipers were going full blast. I sat there and watched this monster. The sound of it changed. That flat roar just dropped away, and the debris that had been going around the outside of it, looked like boards and sheet metal and dirt and God knows what, began to slow down. Everything got quiet enough that I could hear my own wipers again. Then I saw more arms coming around. 2 more tendrils or offshoots came out of the near side. One was high and one was low, and they were coming towards the road, in my direction. Unlike the ones I saw before, they weren't curling up or feeling along the ground. They came out straight and stopped, both of them at the same time, about 200 yards from the front of my truck, and they held right there. It felt like I was being pointed at. A massive monster of nature sprouted arms and pointed at me. No, that sounds crazy. That's what a crazy man would say. I don't believe a tornado has eyes. These things don't have a face or a brain. It's a column of air with a pressure deficit. But there's a thing that happens to you when a deer comes up out of the ditch and looks at you. There's a moment where you realize that the thing across from you has become aware of you. To it, you've basically gone from being scenery to a subject. Every animal on Earth knows that feeling. It's older than we are. That is exactly what happened to me on that road. Every hair on my arms stood up, and my mouth went so dry. My entire body all at once, with total certainty, was thinking one thing. It just noticed you. And like some prey animal, I didn't move. I couldn't move. Out in front of the tornado on the ground, right at the edge of the debris where the dirt was still being pulled up, a familiar figure was standing there. Yes, standing there, basically in it, where the wind would have been strong enough to take the pavement off the road. Lightning flashed, and I saw him for a split second. His dark shape and arms at his sides. How was this man not being hit by debris at the very least? It went dark again, and there was another flash right after. As before, his arm was up, and he was pointing east-southeast. Not at me, but past me, off my right shoulder down the road, out over the hills. I turned my head and looked where he was pointing. There wasn't anything out there but green hills and rain, with 8 or 9 miles of Arkansas. When I looked back, the tornado's tendrils had drawn back in. The debris spun faster like before, and the roar came back, so loud it almost deafened me. I even flinched hard enough to hit my elbow on the door. I swear to you, I saw that tornado turn east-southeast, going the exact way the man had been pointing. Storms in this part of the country move northeast. All day that one had gone east and east-northeast, right along with every other storm in the state. But I was there. I watched it stop, look at me, and change course. This mile-wide tornado, seemingly at the behest of a strange figure on the ground. That's the moment. If you ever wondered why some old man in Arkansas thinks tornadoes are alive, that's the moment I decided. I got the truck moving. I drove east on the paved road, and about 2 miles down the road my brain came back online, and I realized I needed to find out where this thing was going. I pulled off at a wide spot and pulled out my collection of maps from under the seat, spreading the top one across the steering wheel. I put my finger on the map at the bridge where I'd wrecked my camera, and I traced where I saw it go. East, east-northeast, and now east-southeast, from about where I was sitting. I ran my finger out along that line. My finger went across the creek, across the north end of Mabry Ridge, and then down into a little pinched-in green place on the map which had a thin blue line running through the bottom, labeled Cade Hollow. I sat there, staring at my own finger on that map. I didn't want to believe it. I told myself it would be on the ground 25 minutes, thin out, then die, like most of them do. Or at least the ridge would kill it. But then I looked out the windshield at the sky southeast of me. The storm was still going, and still going in the direction I didn't want it to. It was going to Cade Hollow, right towards Dixon's house. The man in the field was pointing at that house. He always had been. I floored the truck, tearing up part of the pavement or part of my tires. Probably both. At that moment, there were 3 things I could think to do. First, I would make a call. There was a store at the junction of that blacktop on the highway, a place called Reddick's, which sat on cinder blocks and sold bait and beer. It had a payphone on the outside wall. I was able to get there in about 6 minutes. I jumped out of the truck, never shutting the door, and I yanked at the payphone. No dial tone, not even static. A line was down somewhere, so calling would not be an option. I went inside then. The old man behind the counter had a transistor radio. He let me give it a go, but nothing still. I later learned I came in kind of like a lunatic. He later told a deputy that a man came in, pale as could be, yelling about a poor girl in a valley, then left after trying the radio. The second idea was the CB. I was back in the truck and up on the highway with the mic in my hand going through channels. 19 first, then I tried 9, the emergency channel, which somebody was supposed to be monitoring, but no luck. Then I went back to 19. I heard some voices. It wasn't dead. There were people out there talking, but it was faint. What I could hear sounded like multiple conversations bleeding over each other from a long way off. And a lot of it wasn't even local. If I contacted anyone this way, I knew it would be no one who could get to a phone in town within 10 minutes, and nobody who even knew what Cade Hollow was if I told them. Then on Channel 9, in between 2 of my own transmissions, I heard a voice. It sounded like a girl, coming in clear, and there were 2 words that did not sound scared in the slightest. And what I heard was, "It's okay." I swear to God, that sounded like Caitlin. But my brother didn't have a CB radio, so I must have been hearing things, right? Tell me I was just hearing things. The third idea I had, and the only option left, was to drive, so I kept going. That highway going south is 9 miles from that junction to the Cade Hollow turnoff, with 2 sharp and blind curves and a steep hill coming down the ridge. I made it in a little under 8 minutes. I passed a Cutlass on the shoulder with its flashers on, and 2 people in it, looking up out of the windshield, probably thinking I was insane for still being on the road. The storm was on my right the whole way, and I watched it, and I couldn't help thinking that if I could see it, it was still watching me. It was in the trees on the ridge by then, and the base of it was so wide, it looked like the sky had come down and planted itself on the ground. Out ahead of it was a brown-green smear that was pieces of things it was lifting off the ground. At one point, I saw a sheet of tin about a half mile off my right side, up maybe 400 feet, spinning like a frisbee. Looked like some kind of fantastical bird. I finally made it down the hill. There was already a pine down across the westbound lane. I got around it on the shoulder, and I made the turn, starting down the gravel. Then, about 200 yards down that road, the road tilts downhill steep enough that the road tilts downhill so steep you have to ride the brake the entire way, and the trees on both sides lean in, completely eclipsing the view above you. You're driving through a tunnel, basically, and you cannot see the sky at all. No sky means I could not see where the tornado was, which way it was moving. I had no idea how much time I had left. There's only the one road in, same road out. It would take me 4 minutes to reach that house from here, but I knew it was coming down the ridge above me already. So I was driving blind, going downhill into the exact place that I knew it was going. All the while, that tornado was so big, it could pick up my truck and set it in a tree in a different state. No matter how fast I drove, my turning stomach was telling me I wasn't going to get there in time. It would get there before me, and if I got there any earlier, I would just die with all of them, and Samuel would grow up without me. I slammed on the brakes. I put the truck in park in the middle of that gravel road, and I got out, just standing there. Oh God, I could hear it. It was so loud it wasn't even a sound anymore. It was just sheer, pure pressure. It was definitely coming down the ridge into that hollow with everything it had. And that was a lot. I yelled. I stood on a gravel road in the middle of nowhere, and I yelled my brother's name into a tornado that could have swallowed a freight train. And just a moment later, all at once, it got dark, extremely dark, and the rain began to go completely horizontal. Something hit my truck behind me so hard it left a dent the size of a bowling ball. I got down on hands and knees in the ditch on the uphill side, and I put my face in the dirt, my arms over my head, and I stayed there. It went over the top of me. But it didn't get me. It continued down into the hollow, and all I could do was lay in that ditch, feeling my ears popping painfully twice. All of it lasted about 90 seconds before the sound started to fall off. I got up. I was caked in mud. I had a cut on the back of my hand. I don't remember how it got there. The rain had stopped. That's how fast it ended. The rain was just over, and the light around me was getting lighter. There was a wind coming up the hollow now, moving in the opposite direction of the storm. I got in my truck and I drove down, carefully. The place was a mess. The road was blocked multiple times. There was a hardwood tree down across the gravel at one point, 30 inches across, and by then I had to get out and do the last half mile on foot. I came around the last bend at a jog. The hayfield across the road was gone. It had been scoured to bare red mud, like the entire field all at once had been placed in a blender. Yet only meters away from that was green grass untouched. Dixon's truck was in the tree line about 150 yards from where it had been parked. It was upside down and folded like a wet napkin. And where their house had been, there was nothing. Just an empty, clean foundation. I expected to walk in on a pile, on a wreck that could be searched through, but there wasn't even that. I recall walking damaged paths with the weather service once. I got to see what an F4 does to the frame of a house. It's a debris field. It's a 100-yard path of destruction of lumber and insulation. Somebody's clothes in a tree, somebody's life destroyed. But this wasn't even that. There was a slab and a set of concrete blocks, some pipes coming out of the ground. But all of it was bare, and I mean clean. The winds were so violent that they sandpapered everything clean. Rainwater gathered in one spot and had already gone still. Not one board of that house was left. The porch was gone down to the anchor bolts, and the bolts stood up out of the concrete with the nuts still on them. You know what's awfully funny? The damned chess pie foil dish from Wednesday night was sitting in the yard, 20 feet from the slab upright, with nothing in it. I walked around the foundation in a stupor, twice, calling out. For a decade, there had been a house here, and inside had been the warm and smiling faces of my brother, his wife, and my niece Caitlin. But the only thing truly spared was the chess pie foil dish. They found Dixon at 7 p.m. He was in the fence line at the back of the property, a few hundred yards from the house. He was still in his work clothes he'd put on that morning. The deputy who found him was a kid I'd gone to school with. He came and got me personally. Ruth Ann had been spared, as she had been at school working. She'd apparently been in the interior hallway with 31 third graders on their knees with their hands over their heads, listening to a hailstorm pelting the roof. She had tried to call home at 4:15, but no calls were getting through. She finally got home at 6:30 p.m. Somebody had to be with her when she came down that road, to brace her, and it ended up being me. That's the worst thing I ever had to do. They never found Caitlin. They looked for 11 straight days. 200 volunteers by the second weekend, National Guard and dogs too. They walked the hollow and the creek and both ridges in a grid with flagging tape. They dragged the creek, and they pulled apart every pile of debris in a 2-mile radius. And there wasn't much to find, because there wasn't much debris. They found things: a sock drawer intact in a pasture a mile and a half northeast, photographs stuck to the side of a barn, the owner of which brought me the photos himself. Funny enough, it turned out to be the man I'd sold that Ranger to on Tuesday. But no, they never found Caitlin. Ever. I later got word from the surveyors, the folks from the weather service that come out to rate the damage. They told me it was an F4, the second worst there is. They rate it by damage done, and he mentioned whatever kind of tornado this was, it left a lot more absence than damage. And the worst thing he told me was that the damage path ended exactly at Dixon's house. What are the chances, huh? A tornado came down miles away and beelined its way right to my loved one's location. It was on the ground for 29 minutes, and it traveled a full 13.5 miles, all just to go and ruin lives. And that's my story. For Caitlin's sake, I continue to chase for 25 more years. A lot of stories like this end with, "Oh, you sold everything and quit right away." But that wasn't me. I was out again in June and every spring after that, until my body started to complain. And the reason I kept going out there was different now. I didn't go to see anything. I went to watch things. Does that make sense? Samuel never rode with me. When he turned 13, I never brought it up, and neither did he. Magdalene doesn't like when I tell this story. Brings back too many bad memories. And plus, she doesn't believe the, crazier aspects. I'm not here to try to prove anything to you. I'm simply here to tell you what I believe. I think some tornadoes are sentient. I think when they come down and touch the ground, there's somewhere they need to go, and they won't stop until they get there. Did it choose my brother's house? Did it take my brother's life and Caitlin's? I don't know. Just consider how cosmically horrifying a tornado is, how little we still know about them. The most terrifying moving thing on this planet, and yet it's not alive? Or is it alive in a way that we don't yet understand? I know lives have been lost and upturned by tornadoes in the United States, but I think they're cool. Sort of in the same way that you think Cthulhu is cool. Like you never want to actually meet the guy, are you crazy? Good night. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of Tales from the Break Room. I've been your host, Darkness Prevails. Make sure to follow and rate Tales from the Break Room on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. You can send us scary work-related stories over at eeriecast.com/submit. And if you want more scary narrations from me, you can find my podcast dedicated to unexplained and paranormal stories over at Unexplained Encounters, which you can find on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and your favorite podcast app too. Till next time, everyone, I've got to clock out, but I'll be clocking back in real soon, unless there's a severe weather alert. Hey there, YouTube viewers. This show is available as a podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. Just search for Unexplained Encounters and give us a follow. Thank you. Do you ever get the feeling that a certain person you've encountered just isn't actually human? What if there are human-looking things out there that simply aren't one of us? The following story is titled, "It Wears Human Skin." It's from a viewer with the pen name Garlini. It's one of the more unsettling stories I've read in a while. He claims to be a park ranger for an unspecified national forest. Things can be weird out there at times, but a series of events with striking similarity seems to prove that there is something out there in the American wilderness, and it loves to wear human skins. Forgive me because I'm no writer. I'm not very good at telling stories. In the past couple of weeks, I've typed this out about 4 times, deleting the previous ones. This is basically just the version I stopped editing, the version I settled on. So I'm a park ranger. I've been with the National Park Service for almost 8 years, all of it in the same district in the Northwest. For obvious reasons, I can't name the park, and I can't give my real name. But if you work in NPS and you're reading this, you either already know who I am, or you've heard a version of what I'm about to describe. And in that case, I would appreciate it if you kept it to yourself. I'm doing this to get the word out. I think people should know. My dad was the one who got me this job. He was a ranger in the same district for about 26 years before I started, which is how I even knew the posting was available. He called me one day and told me that they had an opening and that the application window was short. I was 23 and working at a hardware store in Bremerton, going nowhere in particular with my life. So I applied. Now I wish I could say there was something romantic about it, some deep love of the outdoors that pulled me in, but truthfully, my dad handed me a life and I took it because I didn't have one of my own yet. I grew up visiting him on the job, weekend rides in the duty truck, helping him restock trail registers and eating peanut butter sandwiches on the tailgate, while he filled out paperwork. I liked those visits. What I didn't understand until I was actually doing the work myself was that those visits were curated. Dad only brought me along on the easiest of days. He never took me on a body recovery, for example, or out to look for a lost child or a 3-hour bushwhack to tag an injured elk for Fish and Wildlife. Basically, the version of the job I grew up seeing with him was a highlight reel, and I didn't really find that out until I was already on payroll. I should tell you that I'm not built for this work, not the way he was. Dad could spend 4 days alone in the backcountry and would come back looking 10 years younger. On the other hand, I spend one night in a fire lookout and my hands shake for an hour the next morning. I've been on sertraline since I was 19. I check the locks on my duty cabin twice before bed, then I check them again when I get up to use the bathroom at 2 a.m. I know the second check is pointless because I did it 3 hours ago and nobody has come in since. But I do it anyway because my brain needs the confirmation that everything is safe and secure. That's how my mind works. And I manage it. Most days I'm fine. I do my job well enough. Nobody's ever had a complaint about me yet. My performance reviews would say things like reliable and thorough, which are the words people use when they mean you're not exciting but you do show up. Now let's truly get into the story. The first thing happened in my second year. Early September, the tail end of hiking season. It's around the time the days are still warm out, but the light starts dropping off fast after 5. We got a report from a woman at the main trailhead lot that her husband had not come back. He had left that morning for a day hike on one of the eastern loops, a 12-mile trail with moderate difficulty. The man was 44 years old and was experienced. He had done the route before, too. He told her he'd be back by 4, and at 7, she called us. This happens more than people think. Usually the hiker miscalculates time or twists an ankle, or just sits down somewhere pretty and loses track of the afternoon. 9 times out of 10, they walk out on their own, sheepish and apologetic, and you meet them on the trail with a flashlight while they're already heading back. Anyway, we started the search at first light the next morning. There were 4 two-person teams fanning out from the trailhead, each covering a section of the loop and the surrounding off-trail areas. I was paired with another ranger named Colby. Colby's a seasonal guy in his second summer who talked too much and hiked too fast. We were covering a section off the main trail, the east side, where the loop cuts close to a gully that feeds into the creek system below. It's dense in there. Think Douglas fir, western red cedar, ferns up past your waist in some spots. Lots of deadfall, too. Big old trunks gone soft with rot that crumble when you step on them. Not a place a day hiker would normally wander into. But we check everywhere because lost people don't go where they're supposed to, obviously. Colby was about 30 yards ahead of me, working a line closer to the trail, when I pushed through a stand of sword ferns and looked down into the gully. I found the body around 10 a.m. It was lying face up at the bottom of the gully, about 50 yards off the trail, settled into the ferns, like someone had put it there. It was flat on its back, arms at its sides, legs straight. The first thing that registered with me was how pale the skin was, but evenly pale. Like the color on the skin had been mixed in a bucket, then painted perfectly. There was no mottling or lividity, no discoloration or bruises. But then I saw the face. The mouth was open, real wide, far wider than normal, living or dead. I checked later and the joint was intact, no dislocation or displacement. The mouth was just stretched open, like the muscles that should have held it shut had simply stopped existing. The lips were pulled back from the gums, and the teeth were gone, most of them. They were scattered on the ground around the head, in the ferns and the dirt, like someone had dropped a handful of chiclets into the grass. I could see them, small and white, on the brown mulch. Some of them still had the roots attached, long, pale, tapered roots, intact and whole. They'd come out clean from the inside, it looked like, pushed outward through the gums. A few of them had landed 6 inches from the face. Whatever had forced them out had done it with enough pressure to scatter them. I called this in. Then I sat down on a mossy log about 20 feet away and waited nervously. When you find a body, you mark the GPS, you radio the coordinates, and you don't touch anything. A few minutes later, Colby came crashing through the brush. I told him to stay back, and he did, though he kept craning his neck trying to see past me into the gully. I told him he shouldn't look, but he looked anyway. He didn't say anything after that, which was the quietest he'd been all summer. I sat on that log for 45 minutes waiting for the recovery team. Colby stood about 10 yards behind me, texting on his phone, which technically wasn't supposed to get reception out here, but sometimes it did. I spent most of that wait trying to figure out what was bothering me, beyond the obvious. It took me a while, but then I realized it was the smell. There was no smell. A body in the woods in September, even one that's only been there overnight, should smell like something. Maybe not rot yet, but there's biology to it still. The system shuts down when you die. Sweat, waste, and the first stages of bacterial work. I've had the unfortunate pleasure of experiencing the heaviness in the air around a fresh body. And you notice that, even if you can't name it at the time. I'd been on 2 other body recoveries by then, both exposure cases from the previous winter found in the spring thaw. And both times, the smell was what told me I was close before I ever saw the bodies. This one had nothing. I was 20 feet away and the air smelled like dirt and wet ferns. To my scent, it was just the smell of the morning fog burning off the canopy. The body was not, well, participating in the forest around it. It was like it was part of the scenery, a prop someone had left on the ground. The other thing I noticed while I sat there was the complete lack of insects. Again, I'll remind you this was September in the Northwest, in a gully with standing water and decaying plant matter. How were there no insects? Mosquitoes had been chewing on me and Colby since we left the truck. I had 3 bites on my neck alone, but the body had nothing on it. Nothing crawling on it or buzzing around the open mouth or eyes. Flies will find a dead animal in the woods within minutes. I'd been sitting there close to an hour, and that body was untouched. Like to nature, this was not a food source. Nature itself was treating it like it wasn't even biological. The recovery team hiked in around noon. They bagged it and carried it out, and I went back to the trailhead, doing my paperwork in the bed of my truck. I liked doing that because my office felt too small and too inside. Then I drove home and sat down for a while, waiting for my leg to stop bouncing. Here's the catch. That body did not match the missing hiker. Different build. The hiker was 6'1", broad-shouldered, a weekend weightlifter according to his wife. The body was slight, 5'8" at most, with a narrow frame. Completely different estimated age, maybe late 20s against the hiker's 44. They had different hair colors too. When the dental records came back, what was left to compare anyway, they didn't even match anyone in any database. Same thing with the fingerprint match. No missing persons report anywhere in the state fit the description. The medical examiner's report said cause of death was undetermined. They could find no trauma, no toxicology, no disease, no signs of exposure, no evidence of animal predation. The notes mentioned the jaw and the teeth, but framed it as anomalous post-mortem changes of unknown etiology. I read that phrase in the report and remember thinking it was a very comfortable way to say, I have no idea what happened here, and I'd like to stop thinking about it. There was one other thing in the ME's notes that I didn't understand until later. Under internal examination, a single line was there. Absence of expected organ weight. Thoracic and abdominal cavities presented without significant visceral mass. Noted for further review. Even after reading it 3 times, it still didn't click. I mean, I'm not a medical professional, so I wasn't sure what I was expecting. I didn't know what "without significant visceral mass" meant in practice. It would be years before I understood what that examiner was saying. That, in the most cautious language possible, they were saying the body was mostly empty. That further review part never even happened, as far as I know. The case stayed open, nobody closed it, and nobody pursued it. It just stopped moving. The missing hiker, the 44-year-old husband, he was never found. His wife called the station every week for 2 months straight, then every other week, then once a month, then she stopped. I wasn't the one who took her calls, but I was in the office for some of them, and the sound of someone's hope thinning out is not something I like to describe. You could hear it in the pauses between her questions, because those gaps got longer. No one connected the body in the gully to the missing hiker, because there was nothing to connect. It was a different person entirely, as far as anyone could tell. 2 unrelated events that happened to occur in the same area at roughly the same time. Coincidence or bad luck? Just the woods doing what the woods can do to people. Now, my dad was still alive back then, still working the district, same as he had been since before I was born. He was 58 years old, and his knees were starting to go, but he still hiked faster than anyone under 30 on the staff. I told him about the body over dinner a few nights after. Just the broad strokes, the teeth, the jaw, the ME's non-answer. He listened closely, never interrupting. He kept his eyes fixed on mine the whole time, and stopped moving his fork. Eventually, when I was done, he said something to me like, 26 years and I've seen a dozen things I couldn't explain. The woods don't run on our schedule, and they don't owe us any answers. He said stuff like that. I don't think he meant it to be dismissive. He just had a way of putting things in a box and pressing the lid down flat, stacking something heavy on top afterwards. And when he did it, you believed the box would stay shut, and you wanted it to. So I let it stay shut. I was 2 years into a job I wasn't even sure I could handle on a good day, and I had a father who could look at the inexplicable and simply shrug. I wanted more than anything to be someone who could do that too. So I hid that memory in the same place I put all my memories that threatened to crack the floor I'm standing on. Somewhere so deep down that even the medication won't touch it. For a while, that worked fine. My dad died 14 months later. It was pancreatic cancer, caught too late. Apparently, pancreatic cancer is quite sneaky like that. He went from diagnosis to gone in about 11 weeks. I'm not going to write too much about this. After all, it's not what the post is about, and because I still can't do it without my hands starting up again. I'll say this, he didn't complain, and he wasn't scared. On the last day he was conscious, he asked me how the trail conditions were looking for spring. That's just my dad. He died and I stayed in the district, and I kept doing the job. It kept me distracted. People told me he would be proud of me for keeping the job. Maybe. I think he'd be more confused than proud, honestly. He knew I was scared of everything. He just had the grace to never say it out loud. The next few years were quiet. I did my routes, took my meds. I got to know the other rangers who cycled in and out. Some of them were good, but some of them were just passing through on the way to get better posting. I found a rhythm that worked, as long as nothing disrupted it, which is another way of saying I built a life out of holding very still, hoping nothing noticed me. That body in the gully I found, set in my mental box, and the lid still held. But I did think about it sometimes, late at night when the cabin settled, those moments when your brain decides sleep just isn't happening. But thinking about something and doing something about it are very different activities, and I've always been better at the first one. 4 years went by. Then they found the second one. Before I go on, let me talk about Philip and Richard. Philip Herrera started the same year my dad died. He was 24 at the time, fresh out of a forestry program. He could sit next to you at lunch for half an hour without saying a word, and you'd somehow enjoy the company. But he wasn't exactly shy. He just didn't start conversations. But if you initiated one with him, he'd ride it wherever you wanted to go. and he would remember the details weeks later. He once asked me a follow-up question about something I'd mentioned in passing about my truck's transmission 3 months after I said it. The thing about Philip was the horror stuff. He was into it. Some dudes like fly fishing, hunting, but Philip liked scary stuff. Creepypasta, folklore, paranormal podcasts, VHS-era slasher films, the whole shebang. He had a bookshelf in his cabin that was half field guides, and the rest was paperback horror anthologies with cracked spines. When he first started, whenever he would meet a ranger in the district for the first time, he would ask them what the strangest thing they'd ever experienced on the job was, the only time he really initiated conversations. Most folks gave him nothing. It was stuff like weird noises or a tree that fell awkward, or the rudest hiker you've ever heard. He wrote all of it down in a little notebook. I was no exception. He asked me too. I had told him about the time I found a boot on the trail with no foot in it, and no owner anywhere nearby. I didn't tell him about the body in the gully, though. Not sure why. Maybe because the boot story fit neatly in Philip's notebook, and the body could stay in the box. Then there's Richard K. He had been in the district for about 3 years by the time the second body turned up. He was 33, had previously did something with insurance in Portland that he never talked about, and I always assumed that meant he didn't like it. He transferred to NPS through some career change program, and took to it immediately. Richard was the guy who packed an extra Cliff Bar in case you forgot yours. He'd give you his rain shell if yours was in the truck. He named the chipmunks around the station and got genuinely upset whenever one of them stopped showing up. He was very soft-hearted, almost to a fault, but it was so genuine that it never really got there. The man cared about things openly and without embarrassment, and being around him made you think, dang, I wish I was like that. The three of us weren't best friends. We were co-workers who liked each other, which I think is its own rare and specific thing. We would eat lunch together when our schedules overlapped, and we would carpool to the grocery run in town sometimes. One time, Richard lent me a book once, and he never asked for it back. Philip and I watched a Mariners game at his cabin one night, but neither of us said much. But that was fine. We were three dudes who were comfortable around each other, and it didn't need to be more than that. It was my 6th year, in late October. A couple in their 30s had reserved a backcountry campsite on the North Fork Trail, a 2-night permit. When they didn't check out on their scheduled date, and their car was still in the lot the following morning, a search was initiated. Their campsite was found and intact. The tent was still staked, and there were sleeping bags inside, a cook kit hanging from the bear wire. There were 2 packs leaning against a log, food still in the canister, untouched. We could not find any sign of a struggle, no sign of anything at all. It looked like 2 people had stepped away to get water and never came back. The car in the lot had a coffee mug in the cup holder with a ring of dried milk in the bottom. I was on the search team with a ranger named Gillette. We were working a grid pattern north of the campsite, pushing through heavy brush along a deer trail that followed a ridgeline. About a quarter mile out, in a thicket of salal and Oregon grapes so dense I had to turn sideways to get through it, I saw the body. My legs stopped working for a second, genuinely. My brain sent the signal and my legs said no. I knew what I was looking at before I consciously processed any of it. The skin, the color, and that same flat, even mannequin pallor. A body lying on its back in the brush with its arms at its side and its mouth wide open. I stood there for about 10 seconds, which is a long time to stand still in the field with your partner 20 yards away calling your name. Eventually, I heard him. Gillette was asking if I was okay. I told him I found something and that I needed a minute. He probably thought I was about to throw up, but I wasn't. My body was doing something else entirely, trying to be in 2 times at once. I was standing there in the October brush, staring at a body, and I was also sitting on a mossy log 4 years ago, in a gully, smelling nothing where there should have been something. This one was female. Small build, dark hair, mid-20s maybe. No match to either of the missing campers. It had that same incorrect freshness, and the same untouched skin and absence of smell, and that disinterest from insects, even though I saw them everywhere else. The mouth was open, the jaw wide, but this time the teeth were all there, every one of them, clean and white and in place. The jaw wasn't wrenched or torn, but open, relaxed open, if that makes sense, sort of like someone falling asleep on a long car ride. Even so, it looked like the same thing. I could feel it in my bones. Whatever I'd found in that gully 4 years ago, here was another one, 12 miles north. I called it in. Gillette and I sat with it. He kept looking at me funny because I think my face was doing something I wasn't aware of. I asked him not to include that in his report, and he said, "Include what?" A good man. The ME's report came back 10 days later. I requested a copy, which I had to justify to my supervisor, a woman named Chloe, who was efficient and disinterested in anything that created extra paperwork. But I explained that I'd found a similar body years ago, and I wanted to compare notes. She gave me a look that lasted about 2 seconds too long, but then approved the request. Here are the notes. Cause of death undetermined. No trauma, no toxicology. Internal examination noted the same thing as the first. Reduced organ mass. The body was lighter than it should have been for its size, and this time the examiner added something new. Lacerations in the esophagus and upper trachea. Deep vertical scratches running from somewhere below where the stomach should have been and up through the throat, like something with a rough surface had dragged itself through from the inside. The scratches were clean and dry. There was no blood or inflammation, no signs of healing. Whatever made them did it close to the time of death, or close to whatever we were calling death, since nothing about these bodies followed the rules of dying, or humanity for that matter. A thought came to mind when I finished reading the notes, that whatever had left the first body behind had gotten better at crawling out. The missing couple was never found. Their families called, and those calls followed the pattern I already knew from 4 years back. I had to sit in that office and listen to hope die again. I tried to connect the two cases officially. I wrote up a summary and kept it dry and factual, then submitted it to Chloe with a request, asking for it to be forwarded to the regional office for review. She read it in front of me and said, "These are 2 unidentified remains found 6 years apart in different locations. They have no apparent connection to each other or to any missing persons. What exactly do you want regional to do with this?" She wasn't being cruel. She was right. On paper, there was nothing to connect. I wanted to say that they're the same and they feel the same, that we're dealing with strange bodies that have nothing inside them and the same nothing around them, and that if you look closely that nothing about this makes sense. But you can't write that kind of stuff down in a federal report. This isn't some note in a survival horror game. So I just thanked her for the time and went back to my cabin, and I sat on the edge of my bed for a while. 3 months later in January, Philip, Richard, and I pulled a 2-night backcountry assignment, a trail survey after a series of late fall storms. We had to check for washouts, downed trees blocking access, structural damage to the footbridges on the upper loop. It was a long enough route that camping made more sense than trying to rush it in a day. I almost asked to swap off the assignment. I'd been sleeping badly since October, worse than my usual bad, and the thought of 2 nights out there put a knot in my chest, which I couldn't have explained to anyone without sounding like I was going mad. But I didn't swap, because Philip and Richard were both on the roster and I trusted these guys, and also because my dad would have done the survey without even thinking twice. Even then, I was still measuring myself against a dead man's calm. I packed my bag and went. The first day was good, actually. Cold and clear. One of those January days where the air feels like it's been cleaned. We hiked the lower section, flagging 2 washouts and a bridge with a cracked stringer. We ate trail mix and jerky, and we made camp at a designated site on a flat bench above the creek around 4. Richard brought an absurd amount of food. Summer sausage, a few different kinds of cheeses, crackers, bags of those little mandarin oranges. He laid it all out on a flat rock like a buffet. Philip said it looked like a charcuterie board for people who shop at gas stations. Richard took that as a compliment and said thank you, that he had worked hard on it. We got a fire going as the light dropped. The temperature was falling, but the sky was clear and there was no wind. which is rare up there in the winter. The smoke went straight up. We sat on logs around the ring and ate too much of Richard's food, talking about nothing important. Philip was trying to convince Richard to watch some Korean horror movie that he said was the best thing he'd seen in 5 years. Richard said he didn't like scary movies because they made him feel bad for the characters. Philip said that was the point, but Richard said no. He meant he'd feel bad for days afterward, and it would just ruin his week. Knowing Richard, I believed him. Around 8, the conversation hit one of those comfortable lulls where no one feels the need to fill it, and then Philip said, "You guys hear about Bud Gianelli?" Richard shook his head. I hadn't either. Philip poked at the fire with a stick and settled back. "He was here before either of you. Retired maybe a year before you started," he said, nodding towards me. "A quiet guy, apparently. The old-timers said he almost never talked about himself. But there was this one thing he told a couple people, and it made the rounds." "Of course you know what it is, huh?" Richard said. "Of course I do." Philip snapped the stick in half and tossed the short end into the coals. "So, Bud's doing a solo patrol in the upper North Fork. Late summer, maybe 05 or 06. Long day, nothing happening. He's heading back down and he comes around a switchback, and there's a guy on the trail about 50 feet ahead, just standing there. Bud calls out. The guy turns around and waits for him. "Okay," Richard said. They walk together for about a mile. Bud tries to make conversation. The guy answers, but barely, just short replies. He doesn't volunteer anything. Bud figures he's just tired. Maybe he's one of those hikers who doesn't want to chat. No big deal. So they're walking, and at some point Bud stops to fix his boot. The laces came loose or whatever. He looks down for maybe 15 seconds. Philip paused. He looks back up. The guy is gone. Richard waited. Gone where?" "That's the thing. The trail was straight for 100 yards in both directions. No side trails, steep hillside on one side and a drop-off on the other. There was nowhere to go. The guy was just gone." "He could have ducked into the trees to piss," Richard said. "On a steep hillside with no shoulder? In 15 seconds, without making a sound? Without Bud hearing a single footstep?" Philip shrugged. "Sure, maybe." Richard looked into the fire. "Okay then, that's weird." "It gets weirder. Bud told a couple guys about it over beers. They asked him what the man looked like, and he couldn't say. He'd start to describe the face and just trail off, like the memory wouldn't stay in his hands. After a few weeks, he could barely remember the encounter at all, just that it happened and that it bothered him." "What do you mean he couldn't remember?" "I mean the details wouldn't stick. He knew there was a man, he knew they walked together, but the specifics kept sliding away. The face, the clothes, the voice, all of it just sort of dissolved." Nobody said anything for a few seconds. The fire popped and sent a thread of sparks up into the dark. "That's freaking creepy, Phil," Richard said. Philip grinned. I laughed, but I was thinking about the trail Bud had been on when it happened. Upper North Fork. The second body had been found about 2 miles from that section. I didn't say that. I sat with it and let the conversation move on. We turned in around 9:30. I was in my bag, Philip was in his tent, Richard was in his, and I was staring at the nylon ceiling trying to convince my brain to shut down, which is a negotiation I lose most nights. The creek was loud enough to cover the small sounds. It was peaceful. Otherwise, it was total silence out there. Without the creek, it would have been too unsettling for me to fall asleep. Out there at nights like this, you have to have something else to listen to. The downside was, though, that I could not hear what was moving around us. I don't know what time it was when I heard Richard's zipper. If I had to guess, I think it was around midnight. I heard him get out of his tent, footsteps on frozen ground, and I assumed he was going to take a piss. I almost went back to the half-asleep I'd been managing. Then I heard him say something. Not to me, but outward toward the tree line. It sounded casual and friendly, like someone had wandered into the camp.
Hey, you okay out there? You need some help?
I was out of my bag quick. I unzipped my tent and the cold hit me, and I saw Richard standing about 20 feet from the fire ring. He was facing the trees to the north. He was looking at someone. I could see the shape of a person standing just past where the ember light gave out. They were about 40 yards from camp in the trees, standing upright and still. I could tell they were facing us, but I could not see the face. I couldn't see much detail at all. I could see the outline, average height and average build. They stood like they were waiting for a bus. There was nothing overtly wrong with what we were looking at, and yet my whole body went cold anyway. Richard took a step toward the shape.
Hey, do you need some...
Richard. I said it too loud for the middle of the night, but I didn't care. He turned and looked at me, and I could see his face in the faint orange light. He looked confused, not scared. He hadn't felt that wrongness like I had yet. I said to him, "Come back to the fire, right now." He looked at me, then looked back at the figure. Something in my voice must have been enough, because he walked back to me without an argument, though he kept glancing over his shoulder. Philip was awake now too, sitting up in his tent with his headlamp on, asking what was happening. I told him there was someone at the edge of our camp. Philip put on his boots and grabbed his flashlight, then aimed it at the tree line. The moment the light hit, there was nothing there. The space where the figure had been was now empty, just trunks and branches in the dark.
"What? I saw someone," Richard said,
though it sounded like he was trying to convince himself as much as us.
"They were right there,"
he pointed. Philip swept the light back and forth. Could have been a hiker, lost maybe.
"They were just standing there," Richard said.
"Well, did they say anything?" Philip asked. Richard started to answer, then stopped. His mouth opened and closed, and his eyes went somewhere far away for a second. Then he said,
I think so, yeah. They said something, but I can't... It was hard to hear over the creek."
I didn't ask what the figure had said. I didn't want to know if Richard had heard what I'd heard from my tent just before I came out, because I had heard something too. Under Richard's voice, under the creek, there had been something else, low and flat, a voice trying to sound normal, but I could hear something underneath, so faint I could almost convince myself I'd imagined it. Something that buzzed, a deep rumbly vibration like a wasp trapped in a cello. It lasted maybe 2 seconds. It was the worst thing I'd ever heard.
"Let's keep the fire up," I said. "I'll take first watch."
They were both fine with that. Philip got the fire rebuilt. Richard sat close to it and kept his headlamp on, aiming at the trees for the next hour, even though the fire was bright enough to see by. I sat with my back to the flames, watching the dark. I was shaking instead of sleeping. At first light, we packed up. I said I wanted to head back early, skip the second night, and nobody questioned it. Philip was quiet on the hike out, but it was different than his usual quiet. Richard was the opposite. He wouldn't shut up the whole way. He talked about the food he'd brought, the bridge that needed repairs, about the Mariners' off-season moves. He reminded me of someone that wanted to fill the air with enough normal words that the abnormal might go away. A week later, I put in a request to be taken off overnight assignments for the rest of the season. My supervisor approved it. I think she assumed it was my anxiety, which, in a way, it was. 5 months later, in June, a day patrol ranger named Tate found a man sitting on a boulder near the Elk Creek trailhead, about 30 feet off the parking area. The man was sunburned and dehydrated. He had a cut on his forehead that had scabbed over badly, and he was sitting very still with his hands on his knees, staring at the gravel between his boots. Tate tried talking to him. The man looked up and told him, "I need to go home." Tate asked him his name and where he'd come from. The man answered both questions, but did not elaborate. He had been missing for 2 days, a solo hiker, backcountry permit, supposed to be on a 3-night loop through the upper draw. His car was in the parking lot, and his pack was gone. Tate called it in. The man was coherent enough that it wasn't a medical emergency, but he was clearly in rough shape. The man was hypothermic despite the June warmth and dehydrated, scratched up from off-trail travel. They brought him to the station and got him water and a blanket. Then they started the standard lost hiker debrief. Where did you leave the trail? When did you realize you were lost? Do you remember landmarks? He answered everything in short sentences. He'd left the trail at the Upper Fork Junction. He'd gotten turned around sometime the first afternoon and spent a night in the open. He found the creek the next morning and followed it down. A pretty typical lost story. The ranger doing the debrief wrote it up, and that would have been the end of it, except Tate mentioned it to Philip at shift change. It was an offhand comment. We found a guy sitting by Elk Creek. Looked like he'd seen a ghost. Tate didn't mean it literally. It's just a saying after all. But Philip, you know how he has a nose for this stuff, he asked a couple of follow-up questions, and something about the answers made him come find me. You should talk to this guy, Philip said. He was standing in the doorway of my cabin with his hands in his pockets and a look on his face I hadn't seen before. The lost hiker from Elk Creek. He told Tate something about meeting another hiker on the trail before he got lost. Tate didn't push him on it, because the guy was pretty shut down by then, but the way he said it. I don't know, man. I think you should go talk to him. Philip didn't say why he thought I specifically should be the one to do it. He didn't reference the camping trip or that figure in the trees. We never really talked about that night much anyway. And yet he came to me, and I think that tells you something about what Philip knew without knowing it. The man was still at the station at the time. He'd refused a ride to the hospital and was sitting in the break room drinking a Gatorade, staring at the microwave. I pulled up a chair across from him, and I told him I was a ranger and that I'd heard he'd had a rough couple of days. I said I just wanted to make sure we had the full picture. I asked if he could tell me what happened from the beginning. He didn't even look at me right away. He was tugging at the label on the Gatorade bottle, nervously. Eventually he said, I met someone on the trail. I waited. His story came out slowly. He was on the Upper Fork about 4 miles in, moving slowly because his pack was heavy and the trail grade was steep. He came around a bend, and there was a man on the trail ahead of him, about 60 feet out, walking the same direction. He said the man had an average height and build. He wore a green jacket and jeans and had a pack on. The man heard him coming and turned around, waiting for him to catch up. He gave a little wave, too. Our survivor here waved back. They fell into step together. The man seemed normal at first and friendly. He said hello, said something about the weather, the standard trail small talk. The survivor asked where he was heading. The man gave an answer. The survivor told me he couldn't remember what the answer was. They walked together for maybe a quarter mile. The survivor did most of the talking. He told me he was a talker on the trail, liked to have company, and the other guy seemed to like having company. After a few minutes, he started to notice things, though. The man had a flat, level voice. Every word came out around the same pitch and the same volume, like the worst actor reading off a card. The survivor figured maybe the guy was just tired, maybe shy or not a native speaker. Then he described something that made my heart skip a couple beats. He said that there was something underneath the man's voice, a low hum or vibration, like the sound you hear when you're near a power transformer, a deep electrical buzz you can feel in your back teeth. Except it was coming from the man's chest or throat. He only noticed it during pauses in conversation when the man was not speaking, and even then it was faint. He told himself he was imagining it. But then, the eyes. The survivor tried to make eye contact, but couldn't. The man would turn his face toward him when he talked. The orientation was right. The head was aimed at his. The face was aimed at him. But the eyes were off. They'd be pointed at a spot just to the left of the survivor's face, or just above his forehead. When the survivor shifted, leaned a little, or turned his head, the man's eyes did not track. They would adjust, but always to a different, wrong spot. It was like they were approximating where to look without understanding the concept. I remember the way he described it, like trying to make eye contact with a painting, and I liked that, though it was extremely creepy. Probably why I remember it after all this time. Said everything's facing you, but nothing's looking at you. The survivor stopped on the trail and told the man he needed to check his map. The man stopped too. This was the part where the survivor put the Gatorade bottle down and his hands went flat on the table. The man just stood there. He didn't take off his pack and he didn't sit down. He didn't drink any water. He just stopped moving and stood there on the trail facing the survivor, arms at his sides. He could have been a mannequin in a store window like that, completely lacking shifting weight or fidgeting. People don't stand perfectly still like that. People are always doing something. This man had stopped, and the stopping was complete. Like pausing a video, nothing like stopping mid-hike. The survivor said he stood there pretending to look at his map for about 30 seconds, and in that time, the man did not move once, did not blink, he did not breathe, or at least didn't see him breathing. But that buzz, it was still there, louder in that silence. He folded his map and put it back in his pocket. He told the man he had just realized he needed to double back because he had missed a junction. The man didn't respond right away, but soon he said, "Okay." Same flat tone. The survivor turned and started to walk back up the trail. He told me the worst part of the entire experience was the 15 seconds after he turned his back, because he didn't hear footsteps behind him. He didn't hear anything. He wanted so badly to run, but he kept his composure and walked briskly, without looking back. He left the trail at the first game path he found and pushed into the brush and kept going. That's when he got completely and hopelessly lost. He spent the night under a Douglas fir with no shelter and no fire. He barely slept. Twice during the night, he swears he heard someone call his name from the trees. Clear, calm, his first name, spoken in that level tone from before. He told me he had never given the man his name. He said he was sure about it, would swear his life on that fact. I talk too much on the trail. I know that. I told the man where I was from. I told him about my dog. I told him about the drive up. But I'm telling you, I never gave him my name. I know I didn't. Because right before I got off the trail, I was thinking, why did he never ask? Most people ask. I then asked if the other hiker followed him off the trail. He said he didn't think so. He never saw the man again after he turned his back. But both times his name was called, it came from a different direction. The first call was uphill to the east. The second was downhill to the west. Both calls sounded the same distance away. I didn't say anything after he finished. I was kind of turning it over in my head. He kept peeling at the Gatorade label again. He'd gotten most of it off by now, and was now working at the adhesive residue with his thumbnail, scraping it into little gray rolls on the table. I watched him do it, and I didn't trust myself to speak yet. I took a few deep breaths. Then I asked him one more question. I asked if the man's eyes had ever looked directly at him, even once, even for just a split second. He thought about his answer for a very long time before he gave it. But finally he said, No, I don't think he ever did." I drove home that night and sat at my kitchen table, pulling up both ME reports on my laptop. I read them carefully, side by side. The first body. The teeth were pushed out, jaw forced open, mostly empty inside. The second body, the jaw was open, teeth intact, throat scratched from the inside, also mostly empty inside. And now we had a living witness who had walked beside something that couldn't make eye contact, could not modulate its voice, which stood like nothing on earth stands when it wasn't moving. Forgive me, but I'm gonna tell you what I think is happening. I obviously don't have all the evidence for this. I have 2 bodies and a camping trip, and a delirious hiker who heard his own name called from the dark by something he had never given it to. In terms of evidence, that's all I have to go on. But anyway, what do I think? Well, I think something is out there in the deep back country, in the parts of the forest where the trails thin out and the canopy closes and you can walk for 8 hours without seeing another human soul. I think, whatever it is, it builds these things, these bodies. They're more like suits to it. I don't know what it builds them from, and I don't know how. I think it wears them and walks out there to where people are, and it tries its best to look like one of us. And I think it's been doing this for a long time. The first suit was crude. It climbed out and broke the teeth on its way through, leaving the jaw wrenched open, and it didn't care. But the second one was better, cleaner. The teeth stayed put. The exit was more controlled. The only sign that anything had passed through was the scratching inside the throat, and you would need an autopsy to find that. Because of all of this, I think about what the third one might look like. Whether there will be anything left to find at all, or whether it'll just stand up and walk to a trailhead, get in a car, and drive somewhere, sitting down at a kitchen table across from someone who has been waiting for it to come home. I'm reminded of that Bud Gianelli story, about him walking a mile beside a man whose face he couldn't remember a week later. I wonder if Bud noticed the eyes or the voice, and just filed it away as something the woods didn't owe him an explanation for. Maybe Bud was lucky. Or maybe he just wasn't what it was looking for that day. Frequently I think about what Richard, Philip, and I saw in the tree line that night. There was no mistaking that there was someone out there. But was it really someone that needed help? Or was it something else? I'm terrified to think about what would have happened if none of us had woke up. Or if I had never stopped Richard from walking towards it. By morning, would there have been one more empty suit in the brush? One of our tents now permanently empty? Before I leave you, I want to say that if you hike alone in the back country, I'm not going to tell you to just stop doing it. People have been walking in these woods for thousands of years, and most people walk back out just fine. What I am trying to say is, if you meet someone else on the trail, and something feels very wrong, if the voice doesn't sit right with you, or the eyes never quite meet yours, trust that feeling. Those feelings exist in you for a reason. Being rude is much better than going missing forever. Turn around, walk away, and don't look back. Take that final message to heart. The next time you run into someone on a hiking trail or on the side of the road, and they act just a little weird, you might be dealing with something rather than someone. And that something might lead you into the woods to never be found. Good night. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of Unexplained Encounters. I've been your host, Darkness Prevails. Help us out by leaving a follow and review of Unexplained Encounters on Spotify and Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app. You can even find more of my scary narrations on my other podcast, Tales from the Break Room, which is also on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. If you have a scary story of the unknown, send it to me at darkstories.org. Till next time, everyone, stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one. There's a house on a lake in rural Wisconsin that's been sold 3 times in 10 years. Every time, the price drops. Every time, it's a young couple. And every time, it's the wife who starts having trouble sleeping. This story is called The House on Heron Lake. It was posted by Miss Snoot, a woman who lived in that house for 8 months. She made it out, but the woman before her didn't. If you find yourself scrolling real estate listings, and you find a lakeside home at a price that seems too good to be true, it is. Close the tab. For this story, I'm not going to use our real names, or the real name of the lake we were on. I'm a copywriter by trade, which means I spend all day making things sound polished and appealing, and I want to be upfront that I'm not doing that here. I'm not crafting this. I'm just telling you what happened to us between May and January at a house on a lake in rural Wisconsin, and I'm telling you because I don't know what else to do with it, and because someone just moved into that house, so they don't know what's in the water. My husband, Ethan, and I got married in April of the previous year. At the time, we were 28 and 29 years old, and we'd been dating since college. The wedding was small and perfect, and we were happy, just young and in love. We'd been living in a one-bedroom in Milwaukee that cost more than it should have, so after the wedding, we started to look for something outside the city. Ethan had taken a job doing IT support for a company in a small town, about an hour northwest, and we had been talking for months about escaping from the city. Getting some space, a place where I could work from home without hearing my neighbor's TV through the wall, and somewhere Ethan could fish on weekends without having to drive for 2 hours just to find water. The house showed up on a listing site in early May. A 3-bedroom on a lake with a dock, a big porch that faced the water. And the price was so far below what we'd budgeted that I actually triple-checked whether the listing was a scam. It wasn't. It was a real house. The price was real too. Our realtor said the previous owners had relocated and were motivated to sell. I asked why they'd left. She said they'd moved out of state for work, and that answer was good enough for me. I didn't push it. I wasn't going to be picky about this situation. The house had a porch and a dock and a lake view, and it cost less than our current rent. Oh, you better believe I wanted it badly enough to not ask any questions. I didn't want to complicate it. We moved into the place in May, and for 4 months, it was everything we'd hoped it to be. But what happened there, we never saw coming. The house was beautiful and the lake was gorgeous. Our life there was the happiest we'd ever been. The lake was the thing we loved the most. Mid-sized, you could see the far shore, maybe a 1/4 mile across, ringed by trees and a handful of other houses spread wide apart. The water was spring-fed and clear in the shallows. You could see the sandy bottom for the first 15 feet, or 20 feet even, before it dropped off into the deeper green, then into a dark that you couldn't see through. I swam in it almost every day that summer. Ethan fished off the dock in the evenings. We had a bottle of wine on the porch most nights and watched the sun go down over the water. Meanwhile, our cats would sit in the windows, watching the lake like it was their very own personal nature documentary. The cats were named Poppy and Noodle. Poppy was a calico we'd adopted from a shelter during college, nervous and skittish and deeply opinionated about everything. Noodle was a big orange tabby who was afraid of nothing and had once fallen asleep on top of a running vacuum cleaner. I loved them both, but Poppy was my cat, the one who slept on my chest and followed me from room to room, purring so loudly you could hear her through a closed door. We met the neighbor across the lake about a week after we moved in. His name was Dearth. I'm sorry if I'm not spelling that right, I've never heard a name like it. But he was in his 70s, and he had lived on the lake for most of his life. He came over with a jar of homemade pickles. Dearth was friendly, though a bit stoic. I noticed a lot of older rural men in Wisconsin are that way. He would talk to us about weather and fishing, but he always avoided anything personal, unless you fought him on it. He told us about the lake. He was the one that taught us it was spring-fed and very deep in the center. He said there were spots where the bottom dropped to 80 or 90 feet, allegedly, though nobody had ever measured it properly. And he said it never fully froze in the winter. Something about the springs keeping the water circulating. He said something along the lines of, "Gets a shelf of ice around the edges, but the middle stays open, black water all winter." He said it matter-of-factly. I noticed that in the weeks since we'd moved in, I'd never seen Dearth on his dock. In fact, I never saw him near the water at all. The lake was beautiful during the day, but as time went on, it became more difficult to look at after dark. I don't mean spooky, but it was like the water after sunset went flat and black, and it wasn't so easy on the eyes. At those times, there wasn't much reflection or movement. The texture was just gone. It looked less like water, and more like a void, like a big dark hole in the landscape in the shape of a lake, and what was underneath became nothing at all. I made this observation out loud to Ethan once. He said I was being overdramatic. I laughed and agreed, because it did sound silly, at least for now. I swam in the lake for the first time on our third day in the house. It was warm enough that the air had a haze to it, but the water was still holding on to spring. Ethan was on the porch with a box of kitchen stuff he'd been unpacking for an hour, without making visible progress. I walked down to the dock in my swimsuit and stood at the end looking down at the water, which was clear enough that I could see the sandy bottom 8 feet below. There were pebbles and the shadow of the dock posts, and a single bluegill hanging motionless in the shade. "You're stalling," Ethan called from the porch. "I'm preparing." "You've been preparing for 3 minutes, just get in." So I jumped in. The cold hit me like a truck. I swear my whole body seized for a moment. I came up gasping, and I heard Ethan laughing. I splashed some water in his general direction, which fell about 40 feet short, and he raised a coffee mug he was holding in a toast. I then swam out about 30 yards, past the point where I could touch the bottom. This was where the sandy shelf gave way to deeper green. The water was extraordinary once the shock wore off, all silky and mineral clean. I floated on my back and looked at the sky. Then I rolled over and looked down. The green below me was darkening, graduating through shades I could follow with my eyes until it reached a depth where the color simply ended and there was only darkness. The lake bottom was gone or unseeable. Below my kicking feet, I couldn't even tell how far the bottom truly was. And for a second, I felt it. An almost gravitational pull. The same lurch you might get at the edge of a cliff, except inverted, dragging downward. My stomach dropped. I kicked hard toward the shallows, and that feeling broke. By the time I reached the dock, I was breathing hard and laughing at myself. "How is it?" Ethan asked. "Freezing, but amazing. Get in." "Absolutely not." "You bought a house on a lake and you refuse to swim in it?" "I bought a house with a porch. The lake is your department." Well, he did get in eventually, later that week, and he yelped loud enough that Poppy bolted from the window, hiding under the bathroom sink for about half an hour. We swam together most evenings after that, at least for a while. The water warmed up degree by degree until by midsummer it felt like nothing against your skin. The line between human body and lake dissolved. There was a night in late July that I keep coming back to. We'd eaten dinner on the porch, some pasta with whatever vegetables I'd managed to keep alive in the garden, which by that point was mostly zucchini, and we'd gone through most of a bottle of wine. The sun had been down for an hour. The sky was that deep late summer blue that refuses to go fully dark. Ethan wanted to go sit on the dock, and even though I told him I had just gotten comfortable, he pulled me up by both hands, and I complained the entire way until we were sitting at the end of the dock with our feet in the water. Ethan brought the wine bottle. The lake was warm and still. The far shore was a dark line of trees, and the other houses around the lake had their porch lights on, small, gold, and distant. It felt, at that moment, like we were the only real people in the world. The lights were just set dressing. "We should have done this years ago," Ethan said. He meant the move, the lake, the house. "We couldn't afford it years ago." "We can barely afford it now, good deal that it was." "And yet," I gestured at the lake. He clinked the bottle against my glass. Behind us on the dock, a small, determined shape was picking its way towards us, with the exaggerated caution of a creature who found the outdoors personally offensive. It was Poppy. She almost never came outside. She regarded anything beyond the front door as a vast hostile conspiracy. But that night, she walked the full length of the dock, sat down directly behind me, and pressed her face into the back of my neck. Hard. The full skull headbutt that was her way of saying, "I've arrived, and you should now be grateful." I reached back and scratched under her chin. She started to purr, an absurdly loud purr that I felt rattling my collarbone. "She's jealous," Ethan said. "She's supervising," I replied. Poppy settled against my lower back, a warm, vibrating weight, and the three of us sat there at the end of the dock while the sky finished its slow fade to eventual blackness. Then the stars came out in their full glory, and the wine ran low. Ethan talked about a fishing spot one of his coworkers had mentioned. I listened partially. I felt something brush my foot under the water. A fish, probably, or a weed stirred by the current. So I pulled my feet up for a second, then put them back down and forgot about it. That was probably our happiest moment there, and I wish it had lasted. One morning late in the summer, I woke up, and I saw that the sliding glass door to the back porch was open. Just 6 inches, though. Maybe enough to let in the morning air, make the sound of the lake a little bit more clear. But there was a smell on the air, too. Something different. Ethan was already up, making some coffee, so I asked if he had opened it. He said no, and I reiterated that it was open. He said I'd probably forgotten to latch it before bed, and the wind had pushed it further open. I accepted this. The latch on that door was finicky. You had to lift and push it to get it to catch, and if you didn't do it firmly enough, it would drift open on its own. I told myself that's what happened. But I was pretty sure I remembered latching it. I recalled the sound of it clicking and the resistance and the door settling into the frame. I mean, I latched that door every night. It was a nightly ritual by then, and that door in particular was one that I focused on. But at the time, to be honest, I wasn't sure why that door demanded more of my attention. Anyway, I let it go, and I went on with my summer. Our summer. That peculiar smell became more noticeable at the start of fall. It was like this lake water smell, but concentrated and organic. Silty, low tide, like water that has rotting things in it, with a sweetness underneath that was closer to long fermented decay. Not at all pleasant. It was faint at the start. Just a whiff in the kitchen in the morning, gone before I could be sure I'd smelled it. Then stronger just a few days later, hanging in the hallway just outside the bedroom, like a pocket of bad air just wafted in. And it would get stronger still, settling into the back of the house near the sliding glass door, and no amount of cleaning could seemingly touch it. I went through the house with vinegar and baking soda, even bleach. At one point I tried this enzymatic cleaner. Sometimes the smell would retreat for a few hours, but it would come back, as if something was making it seep through our floors. Ethan smelled it sometimes too. He said something that sounded like nothing at first, but I actually looked it up, and it's a real thing. He called it the lake turning over, fall turnover, a phenomenon where the temperature change causes the deep water to rise and the surface water to sink, and the stuff at the bottom, all that decomposition and organic material, just comes up and releases gas. It happens, it produces this sulfurous, rotten smell that can carry inland. I wanted to believe that this is what it was, and for some time I did. But that turnover smell should have been outside, coming off the water. But this smell was coming inside. It was strongest at that glass door in the hallway, in the back rooms of the house. It was like something had tracked it in and left it there. Some mornings it was strong enough that Poppy wouldn't eat her breakfast in the kitchen. She would take one step in, freeze up, then back out. Poppy. Well, I need to talk to you about Poppy. She was acting strange in those weeks, and I think it was the first thing that really scared me. Sometime mid-September, Poppy stopped going near the back of the house. She'd always been a creature of routine. She would go in the kitchen in the morning, sit in the window in the living room during the day, and she'd go to the bedroom at night. Her routine took her through the hallway that ran past the sliding door 12 times a day. But she just stopped. She'd walk to a certain point in the hallway, roughly the point where you could see the glass door at the end of the corridor, and she would sit down and stare at it. There was nothing moving around, and she wasn't looking at the lake outside, but she seemed to be looking at the door itself. She'd sit there for an hour or two at a time, perfectly still except for a low growl. It sounded scared instead of angry. Noodle, meanwhile, continued to be Noodle. He slept on the couch and ate his food, and he would sprawl in the window and watch the lake with that same benign indifference that he gave to everything. But this made me deeply uncomfortable. Why was Poppy the only other living thing in the house that seemed to be aware of what I was feeling? She and I were on the same frequency, picking up this signal that Ethan and Noodle couldn't hear, and that loneliness was worse than the fear that was rising. By the end of September, I started to hear sounds. I would wake up at 2 or 3 in the morning, and I would hear footsteps on our dock. Heavy, soggy steps like someone walking on wood planks with bare feet after going for a swim. The dock was about 30 feet long, and the footsteps would traverse the entire length. Then they would stop. I'd lie in bed with my eyes open, listening to them. And every time, by the time I nudged Ethan awake and he was alert enough to listen, the sound would have stopped. He'd sigh and tell me it was the dock settling, that the wood was contracting in the cold night air. And the first 2 times he said this, I allowed myself to believe it. I mean, who wants to think that there was someone walking out of the lake and onto our dock every night? I like my sleep, thank you very much. By the 4th or 5th time, I stopped waking him up. I would instead lie in the dark and listen to the footsteps come up the dock and stop at the shore end. Then I'd listen to the silence that followed. But it wasn't always a perfect silence. Sometimes I heard faint, almost inaudible, wet weight being dragged slowly across grass. One afternoon in mid-October, I walked out to the dock and I found a trail. It started at the waterline where the lake met the shore, and it went up the dock, across the yard, to the sliding glass door. The grass was pressed flat and slick in a wide path. This was no track or line, but a swath maybe 3 feet across. Something broad and heavy had moved from the water to our house. The grass was darkened and compressed. There was a faint sheen on it, a residue that smelled like the smell in that house. But the trail ended at our glass door. There were no return tracks. How is that possible? It would either have to have gone inside or gone somewhere I couldn't see or track. I called Ethan, who was at work at the time. I described what I saw. He was trying to calm me down, make me feel better. He said it could be a beaver or an otter, but I said it was 3 feet wide. He told me maybe a deer had bedded down and dragged itself. Now he was reaching. Why would a deer do that? The conversation ended, and neither of us had a good explanation. Things were getting creepy. I took some pictures of the trail. By the time Ethan had gotten home at 6, the grass had sprung back and the sheen had dried. But I had proof. I showed him the photos. He looked at them, and after a moment we looked at each other. Neither of us knew what to do, or how serious or unserious it was, but what we came up with was locking the sliding glass door with a dowel rod in the track. I did this every night from then on, and I would check it before bed, then check it again. I swear some nights I would check it a 3rd time, just to help me sleep better. At night, when I lay in the dark listening to the footsteps on the dock, and the silence that soon followed, and that sometimes audible faint wet dragging sound across the grass, well, to me, that sounded like something coming out of our waters, walking to our house, and it was doing it every night, and I swear it was getting closer. That sliding glass door was the only thing between it and me. A few nights before Halloween, I saw it. I finally saw it. I woke up sometime past 2, and I was instantly filled with dread. It was accompanied by this pulling sensation, a compulsion that bypassed my brain entirely and spoke directly to my body. It told me to get up, go to the window, and look out at the lake. I've had compulsions before, like the urge to reread an email or refresh a page. But this was different. There was no fighting it. The best way I can describe it was gravity. Like my window became the low point in the room and I began to roll towards it. So I went to the window and I looked out at the water. The moon was up, 3/4 full. The water was that flat, black, textureless nothing like I described earlier, except where the moonlight hit it. And where the moonlight landed, I could see the dock extending out over the water, pale wood on black surface. And at the end of the dock, there was something that had not been there when I went to bed. It was low and crouched on all 4s, sitting or standing on the last few planks of the dock, close to the water. And even from the bedroom window, maybe 60 feet away, I could tell it was large, wider than a human, and it looked heavy. It even made the dock look fragile underneath it. It was dark and wet. The moonlight caught moisture on its surface, and it was shifting, Small, stuttery movements. Its weight rocked from one limb to another. But it wasn't just adjusting position or breathing. It looked like it was trying to hold something in, like the edges of 3D models from the PS1 era. Something hung from the top of it, where the head would be, I think. Long and dark, dripping wet. It hung down to the planks of the dock. It looked like hair, extremely matted hair heavy with water, and it swayed slightly as the thing shifted its weight. It was facing the house. I stood at the window, looking at it, and I meant to look for just a few seconds, long enough to identify what I was seeing, or failed to do so. And then I would wake up Ethan, make him come to the window and see it there, so that for once he would see what I was seeing, and I would stop being alone in all this. That was the plan. A few seconds. When I looked at the clock, it was 2:47. When I woke up, I swear it was only a bit after 2. I'd been standing at that window for what must have been over 40 minutes. The time between looking at the dock and looking at the clock was, in my experience, about 15 seconds. I'd lost 40 minutes of time. This was not me just zoning out and getting absorbed in this strange sighting. It was like my time simply disappeared, or was taken. And when I looked back, the dock was empty. That thing was gone. Downstairs, the sliding glass door was open, and the dowel rod was still in the track. The door had been opened from the outside, lifted off the track and over the dowel, and sat back down. The night air was coming through now, and with it, that thick, rich, immediate smell. I knew that thing had come to our door from the dock. It had pressed itself against the opening and breathed into our house. I wondered, did it come inside? I quickly closed the door. I went upstairs and got into bed, and I covered my face. I didn't sleep. I laid there for so long listening for any noise, but everything remained quiet. In the morning, that smell was still strong. I didn't tell Ethan about what I'd seen. Up to now, he had not been listening to me. He had not been trusting to my experiences. So I just didn't think I should tell him. But there was a thought underneath that. If he wasn't experiencing this as much as I was, then this wasn't about him, was it? Whatever was happening here, I'm pretty sure it was aimed at me. One disturbing night, I woke up standing in the backyard in my pajamas, barefoot in the frost, facing the lake. The grass was so cold it burned, and the sky was that deep pre-dawn black, almost dawn. I was standing about halfway between the house and the shore, with my arms at my sides. No memory whatsoever of leaving my bed or walking downstairs. I was just there. I'd started to sleepwalk, and I had never once sleepwalked before in my life. I went inside, shaking so hard my teeth were clicking together. I woke up Ethan and told him. The look on his face was fear, real fear, which honestly was a relief. Maybe now he would finally take this more seriously, even if the thing he was taking seriously was my mental and physical health, rather than that lake. It happened again 8 days later. This time Ethan found me. I only know what happened because he told me afterward. He woke up at 3 a.m. in the morning and I wasn't in bed. He went downstairs and the sliding glass door was open. He went outside and there I was on the dock, standing at the very end, at the edge, my toes curled over the last plank, looking down into the water. He called my name, but I did not respond. He walked out onto the dock, grabbing my arm, and apparently I screamed. A scream he described as the worst sound he'd heard me make. Just pure disorientation and terror. I collapsed against him, sobbing and shaking. I had no idea where I was, how I'd even gotten there, or how long I'd been standing over that water in the freezing dark. He installed a chain lock on the bedroom door the next day. The idea was that I couldn't sleepwalk if the chain was engaged, at least not beyond the bedroom. We latched it together every night too, both of us double-checking it. For 1 week, I stayed in bed. But the week after, I woke up on the dock again, standing at the end, barefoot and freezing, facing the water. Upstairs, the bedroom door was closed. The chain was still latched from the inside, and the sliding glass door was open. I have no way to explain how this happened. Ethan drove me to a doctor that week. The doctor explained that sleepwalking is common in adults under stress. A new house, a new environment could trigger it. She prescribed a low dose of something to help me sleep deeper. I filled the prescription and took it, and I slept through the night for 3 nights in a row. But on the 4th night, I woke back up on the dock. After that, I stopped taking the pills. They weren't keeping me inside. If anything, they might have been keeping me from waking up sooner, keeping me from fighting my way back. Late fall, Poppy disappeared. I came downstairs that morning. She wasn't in any of her usual spots. I checked the hallway where she'd taken to sitting vigil, and my bedroom. Sometimes I would find her under the bathroom sink. It was her safe spot when she was stressed out. But she wasn't there either. I searched the whole house. Then I went out into the yard. I walked down the road in both directions, calling her name. Meanwhile, Noodle sat on the porch, watching me. It kinda looked like he pitied me. 2 days later, I found Poppy. For those of you who don't like to read about or hear about harm against animals, be warned. I was standing on the dock in daylight, looking out at the lake because by that point, the lake was where I looked whenever I was missing something. And she was there, about 15 feet out from the end of the dock, floating just below the surface. She was suspended in the clear water, floating like a leaf. She was intact. Her body was whole. Her fur drifted slightly in whatever faint current the springs produced. Her eyes were open and she looked bleached almost, like the color had been drawn out of her calico patches, washed out and faded. She looked like she'd been in the water for way longer than just 2 days. I waded in to get her. The water in late November in Wisconsin is so cold, it's incredibly painful for the first few moments, then becomes this lingering ache the longer you stay in. Every step I took deeper was a step my legs were telling me not to go any further. The water reached my thighs. I was almost to Poppy. I bent down and reached for her when something gripped my ankle. It didn't feel like a fish or weeds. This felt like a hand, a strong hand, and in the half second before I ripped my leg free, I swear to you I felt fingers against my skin. Smooth and cold fingers with what felt like thick webbing between them, pressed up against my ankle as the hand squeezed. It only squeezed once, firmly, as if to get my attention. Then it let go, and I grabbed Poppy's body. I ran out of the water so fast. I was panting and crying, and I might have screamed a couple of times. When I made it to the shore, I collapsed holding my dead cat. I was shaking, and I looked down at my ankle. There was a mark where the hand had been, a white compression that would become a bruise, I could tell. The hand part I didn't tell to Ethan. I told him Poppy must have fallen off the dock at night and drowned. This part was something he believed, but the hand thing, he never would believe. Inside, I was starting to be so angry with him, like I couldn't tell him anything anymore, without some silly explanations that don't explain anything. I felt so trapped, and now my beloved Poppy was dead. I buried Poppy in the yard, near the tree line. She was wrapped in one of my sweatshirts. That night I lay in bed, listening of course to those dock footsteps and the dragging along the grass. I became angry and terrified when I heard that dragging sound approach the yard near her grave. I pulled the covers over my head, and I cried silently. After Poppy, things accelerated. Her death felt like a turning point in the worst possible way. Noodle took up Poppy's post in the hallway, staring at the sliding glass door with ears forward and body still. This should have been comforting, evidence now that Noodle felt something was wrong too. But it was not comforting. Noodle had never reacted that way before, and the fact that he was reacting that way now meant something had changed, and it meant that Noodle was in danger too. One night in early winter, I was lying in bed with the lights off. Noodle was asleep on the comforter beside me. And yet, I heard Noodle meowing at the back door. That sound was coming from outside the sliding glass door, down the hall. It was distinctively Noodle's yowling cry, the cry of a cat that wants to be let in. Any cat owner knows what I'm talking about, and it sounded exactly like Noodle. But Noodle was on the bed right next to me. I could even feel the weight of him against my leg, and I could hear his slow, sleeping breaths. These cat calls went on for maybe 3 minutes, a cycle of meow, pause, meow, and each cry was close to right but not quite right. It was sort of warped at the tail end of each meow. Now that part was something that Noodle had never done. Something was standing outside my glass door in the dark, mimicking my cat, trying to lure me outside. The following morning I found handprints on the outside of the glass, wide and thick-fingered, with smears between the fingers where webbing had dragged across the surface. I was sure of it. They were at my exact height, placed as if to anticipate where my face would be, so I would see them, so I would find them, or perhaps evidence that the thing had peered inside. I took more pictures, and I waited for Ethan to get home. By 6 o'clock, they had dried to faint smudges that could have been anything, and in Ethan's defense, the photos were blurry. When he looked at them, he looked worried but not overly concerned. This time, he didn't even say anything. That silence between us had now become a room we both lived in, but neither of us could leave. Then I started to wake up with my side of the bed damp. I initially thought it was from sweat, but this was cold, and it smelled like lake water, with that deep organic rot sweetness, and it pulled in the depression where my body lay, like someone had poured it there while I slept. Every morning I stripped the bed and washed everything, and every morning the dampness would be back, a cold patch above my pillow and along my shoulder and hip. That smell would cling to my hair and skin. I could smell it on myself throughout every day, even if I showered. I started to have dreams about that lake, and they weren't nightmares. In the dreams, the water was warm and the lake was calm. I walked in from the shore and the water rose around me, and it felt like a warm, wet hug. And it was so comforting. And I could tell in my mind in the dream that there was something waiting in the deep part of the water, down where the springs were, where the light didn't reach. Something patient, and the closer I got, the more it felt like I was going home. I would wake up from these dreams calm, and even feeling better than I had in weeks. But that calmness would soon terrify me, as I realized something was beckoning me into the water, and its calls were working. Of course, I didn't tell Ethan about the dreams. I was running out of things to even tell him. Every piece of evidence I brought to him either degraded before he could see it, or sounded in the daylight like the testimony of a woman who was falling apart. He suggested therapy. I said I didn't need it. We argued about it in the kitchen in low, exhausted voices, and the argument wasn't about therapy. It was about the fact we were now living 2 different realities, and neither of us could cross into the other's. And that thing in the lake, whether it knew it or not, whether it was capable of strategy or just operated on a predatory instinct, too old and too patient for me to outmaneuver, it was isolating me from the only person in the world I truly loved, the one that could have helped. I'm almost certain now that's what it was doing. It was separating me from Ethan. It was a lion separating the injured gazelle from the rest of the herd. But this thing wasn't using force or speed, but slow, steady application of pressure that made me harder and harder to believe, that made my evidence disappear, made my fear look like illness, until the distance between us was so wide, I was functionally alone, even with him sleeping next to me. It wanted me alone. It wanted me alone, and it wanted me tired, and it wanted me dreaming about warm water, and it was getting everything it wanted. Around the middle of December, I found this article. I was looking things up online, anything about the lake, like its local history or folklore or news items, anything I could find. After finding nothing useful, mainly just a couple of forum posts about lake spirits and water hauntings that read like fiction and offered no specifics. I searched instead the address of the house. After some deep digging, I found a local newspaper archive entry from 6 years earlier. A woman had walked into the lake at night and disappeared. She was the wife of the previous owner. The couple our realtor had said relocated for work. But that wasn't the case. This woman's body was never recovered. Her husband had sold the house a month later and moved to an entirely different state. The official cause was accidental drowning. The article included one quote from a neighbor, identified only as a longtime resident of the lake, who said the woman had been having trouble sleeping in the weeks before she vanished. I read through that article 3 times. Then I put my coat on and I walked around the lake to Dirth's house, and I knocked on his door. He knew why I was there. I could tell by the look on his face before I uttered a word. I think he'd been waiting for this visit, but hoped it wouldn't come. "Dirth," I said, "I need to ask you about the people who lived in our house before us." He didn't answer right away. I even watched as he looked past me to the lake. Then he stepped back from the door and said, "You'd better come in." He made coffee. I sat at his kitchen table, and he moved around the kitchen slowly. I could tell he was reluctant. He sat down across from me and set the mugs between us, and I just waited for him to speak. He wrapped both hands around his mug and stared into it. "The house has had trouble," he said finally. That's the way I'd put it. "What kind of trouble?" "The kind you're having. The Lindstroms. That was the last name of the people that were there before you. And before the Lindstroms, there was another couple. I don't recall the name. Both times, they left fast. Those who were left. And both times, it was the wife." I felt a sting behind my sternum. "What do you mean, it was the wife?" "I mean she was the one having problems. Couldn't sleep, couldn't stop watching the water. Her husband thought it was the isolation, thought she was getting anxious out here by herself all day. The Lindstrom woman, she used to walk the yard at night. Her husband would find her standing at the shore in just her nightgown. She told him things were coming out of the lake. He had to take her to a doctor." "And what of the woman before her?" "I don't know the specifics. I know they left in a hurry, and I know it was winter when they did. I know that the wife was not well." "Dirth, the people here before us, the Lindstroms, the wife drowned. I found the article. I know she died." He closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, he was looking at the table between us at the coffee in his hands once more. "I'm not going to sit here and tell you what's in that lake," he said. "I've lived here my whole life, and I don't know. I'm not going to speculate, because speculation is how you start sounding mad. And sounding mad is exactly how every one of those women got dismissed." The kitchen was quiet after that. The clock was ticking on the wall. Through his window I could see the lake, flat and dark in the late afternoon, but not as dark as it could get. "You need to leave that house," he said, and I could tell he didn't want to say it. "I'm sorry. I should have said something when you moved in. Someone should have said something to you before you even bought the place. But I talked myself out of saying anything when we first met. I thought maybe this time could be different." He shook his head once. "It's not different. It's never different. You need to leave." It was the first time in months another human being had confirmed what I was experiencing. I almost broke apart right there in his kitchen. But I managed to hold it together, and I thanked him. I then walked home around the lake in the late afternoon light, and I forced myself not to look at the water. That night I sat Ethan down and I told him all of it. The hand in the water that grabbed me, the wet sheets, the fake cat sounds, handprints, dreams, and the article about the woman who walked into that lake and was never found. I told him I thought the thing in the lake had done this before, and that it chose the woman in the house, and that now it was choosing me. I said if we didn't leave, it was going to get me the way it got her. I said all of this standing in our kitchen with the lights on and the sliding glass door locked. I watched his face while I said it, and for the first time, he didn't push back on me. Something got through. Maybe the accumulation of everything, but it got through. He said okay, we could leave. He began to pack boxes with me that night. We planned to leave on a Saturday morning. Ethan took a personal day on Friday to pack, and by that evening, the house was half in boxes. The kitchen was mostly done. The living room had been stripped of anything that wasn't furniture. Our bedroom was now just a mattress and some overnight bags. Noodle was already in his carrier by the front door, which I had set up that afternoon because I wanted him to be safe. I wanted at least one living thing in this house to be ready to leave at a moment's notice. Noodle sat in his carrier and watched us through the mesh with his wide orange face, and for once, he wasn't staring at the hallway or the glass door. He was watching us, and I chose to interpret that as agreement. I should have insisted that we leave that night. I knew this at the time, and I know it now. My very soul was telling me to go now, go in the dark, get in the car and drive. But Ethan was exhausted, and the car was not fully loaded, and it seemed irrational to flee at 10 o'clock at night when we were leaving at just 7 in the morning. So I did what I'd been doing for months. I rationalized, telling myself 9 hours didn't matter, that the dial was in the track and the chain was on the bedroom door and Ethan was with me and it would be fine. Just one more night. We went to bed at 11. I lay there on our stripped mattress with a single blanket, listening to the house. And for a change, there were no footsteps on the dock or dragging in the grass. The house was so quiet. It hadn't been that way in months. Ethan fell asleep quickly. I didn't. I lay there and watched the ceiling and waited for the sound that would surely come. I'd been conditioned to it. But I fell asleep at some point. I must have. Because the next thing I experienced was not a continuation of lying in bed, but a sharp, gasping return to consciousness. And I was not in my bed. I was in the lake. I was standing waist deep in black water in the dark, and the cold was so total and immediate that my body had not yet processed it. I was past shivering, past gasping for air, in some sort of suspended state where my nervous system was still compiling the information and had not yet delivered the full report. My feet were on the lake bottom, the silty, soft bottom that I remembered from summer, from swimming, back when this water was something I loved and I could feel the ground sloping away in front of me. The shelf, the drop-off where the shallows ended and the deep part began, where 80 or 90 feet of black water sat above springs that never stopped flowing, a bottom that no one had ever actually seen. I was standing at the edge of it. One more step, and the ground would fall away, and the water would take me. I must have sleepwalked again. I had no memory of getting out of bed or coming out here. I'd walked out while unconscious, exactly where it wanted me. The smell was everywhere, fully concentrated all around me, rising from the water, so thick I could taste it on my tongue. The lake at night was the flattest, blackest thing I'd ever seen. No reflection at all, not even moonlight. Just abyssal water in every direction, and the shore behind me. But now it seemed so impossibly far away. My house beyond it with the lights off and the doors open. I then felt it below me. Not touching me, but there in the water around my legs. A current of movement. Something was circling beneath the surface, just below me, moving slow. I could feel the water shifting against my skin as it passed. I looked down. I wish I hadn't. In the faint ambient light, I could see a shape under the surface. Broad, dark, and low, orbiting me. I saw hair fanning out behind it, or from it. Long dark hair spreading in the water like weeds. I saw a hand, too. It drifted up from the shape of it, and it came to rest against my thigh. It didn't grip, but it held on, like it had been waiting for a friend who had finally arrived. I heard Ethan screaming my name from the shore. His voice was so distant and raw. He must have woken up in bed, realizing I was gone, only to find his wife standing in a freezing lake in the dark, the exact situation of the former residence. I knew he was coming for me, to rescue me, but my legs would not respond to my will. The hand on my thigh was gentle and the water around me was cold, but that cold was fading. Or was I fading? Somewhere beneath my terror was that feeling from my dreams, that warmth, the all-encompassing comfort and relief. Something was telling me not to fight, to just let go, and the water would take me somewhere that wasn't here, but was better, and all my exhaustion, fear, and loneliness would finally end. The bottom shifted under me. The silt gave way to nothing. I was at the shelf. One more step and the hand tightened. That thing rose toward me. I felt the water surge as it came up from below. And for a split second, it was directly in front of me, face to face, and I could feel its breath in the water against my chest. A rhythmic pulse of displaced water from something that was breathing underwater, or simulating it at least. Its other hand came up and touched my arm. I watched as its mouth opened. I felt this part more than I saw it, a widening in the dark shape inches from my face. But it kept going past where a mouth should stop. It made a sound then, a sound that did not come from it, not even from above the water. It was in the water. It traveled through the lake and into my body. I felt it in my spine and teeth, a low vibration, and I immediately knew what it meant. Come with me. Suddenly, Ethan had me. He was in the water waist deep, his hands were under my arms, and he was hauling me backward, and that thing let go. Ethan did not overpower it. Ethan is 170 pounds, an IT guy who goes to the gym twice a week. He had not wrestled me free from something that lives in 80 feet of black water. It released me. It let me go, just like it had chosen to let go of my ankle when I got Poppy. It let me go because it decided to, and the decision was not about Ethan, and it wasn't about force. I'm only alive now because I was allowed to leave. Whatever it is, it didn't want to take me by force. It takes only if you choose to go. Ethan dragged me to the shore. I was coughing and gasping, and I was so freezing cold, my muscles had stopped working properly. My legs buckled when I hit the bank. He pulled me up onto the grass and I collapsed, and so did he, next to me. We lay there on the frozen ground in the dark, soaked from the waist down. I could hear his rapid breathing, and I heard the lake behind us, still black and so very silent. Nothing followed us out. Ethan and I did not go back inside the house. He carried me to our car, placing me carefully in the passenger seat. He then wrapped me in the emergency blanket from the trunk. He went back for Noodle in her carrier by the front door, and that was it. That was all we took. He started the car, and we drove away from that house at 1:30 in the morning. The heater was on full blast, and the windows were up. The two of us live in Madison now. We're in a third-floor apartment. There are no lakes or ponds nearby. We're surrounded on all sides by concrete, asphalt, and other people. I should feel safe, right? During the day, mostly, I do. We never did go back for our things. Ethan arranged with a moving company to empty the house and put everything in storage. I told him I didn't want any of it, and he had no arguments or debates about that. The house went on the market in February. I've got no idea what the realtor told the new buyers about why we left. I imagine she said we relocated for work. Ethan and I are okay. but I choose that word carefully. We're functional, and we're together, and we're trying. The space between us that lake had created is still there, but it's smaller now. Some nights he reaches for me in the dark, and I let him hold me, and we don't talk about what happened. That's the good silence, different from what we had at the lake, and I can live with that. But I still dream about the water, even though it's less frequent. At most, once a week. In those dreams, the lake is warm and the water is calm. I walk in and something is still waiting for me in the deep part, patient as it's always been, and I can feel that enticing comfort beckoning me. I wake from those dreams calm and rested, and that still disturbs me. I've started to wonder whether the calm will always terrify me, or whether there will come a point when I finally get over it. Noodle is fine and alive. He's developed a new behavior that I have not mentioned to Ethan yet, though. He seems to stare at the drains in the house. He sits at the edge of the bathtub and watches the drain for a good 10 minutes at a time. His ears will be forward and his body still, and he's so intensely focused. It reminds me of Poppy when she would stare at the sliding glass door. He does the same thing at the kitchen sink, sitting there on the counter staring down into the drain, not moving for some time. I watch him watching it, and I tell myself it's just a cat being a cat. Cats fixate on small dark holes and creepy dark corners. They're wired to watch for prey. But then I remember I had told myself that sliding glass door would stay locked, and I was wrong then. One more thing. One night not too long ago, I woke up, and my feet were wet. I live on the 3rd floor, as I said before. There's no lake. My feet were wet and the sheets at the bottom of the bed were damp. When I sat up and looked at the floor, there were footprints on the hard wood, leading from the front door to my side of the bed and back to the door. I haven't told Ethan, and I pray it's all in my head. I lock and deadbolt the door every night, and I always lie down in bed before going to sleep, just listening for so very long. I pray it lets go of me. I just don't know how long that's gonna be. Well, that was an emotional roller coaster. Rip Poppy, and rip Ethan's marriage. This just goes to show you, if a loved one reports some boogeyman activity,